Bem-vindos to one more episode of the Type Theory for All podcast. As always, this is your host, Pedro Abreu. And this episode is a continuation of episode number 17, which we had Conal Elliott here. If you didn't listen to that episode yet, I'd recommend that you stop this episode and go back to watch that one. Although it's not strictly necessary, I think you can pretty much follow this episode without the need of the last episode. But it's always nice to have a complete view of what's going on. I would say that in episode 17, Conal went down in a more philosophical route to give an in-depth explanation on why he believes that denotational design is a superior form of reasoning in the realm of computer science. In contrast, in this episode, we are a little less philosophical and more concrete on what is denotational design and how is it actually used in practice. We also continue a discussion raised by Dan Gika on the last episode on the need for operational semantics and the role of elegance in reasoning and design. Along the way, we also address the questions sent by the listeners in these last episodes. That being said, let's get into it. All right, welcome everyone to one more episode of the Type Theory for All podcast. It is my great pleasure to be here again with Conal Elliott. Welcome to the show again, Conal.
Thank you. Really glad to be back. Appreciate the chance to continue with some of the things I've been talking about and respond to some comments and questions.
Yeah, we actually got quite some questions. By far, it was the episode that got the most amount of interaction with the listeners. So you're quite popular, man.
Nice to hear.
Before we begin and go into the questions, so I'm planning, I think we are both planning, right, to go and do things a little more concrete about denotational design this time and talk things a little more concretely. Last episode was quite philosophical, which was great. Mm-hmm. So before we start, actually, there was one question that I had in mind last time and I didn't ask. And I feel like it was an important question. Mm-hmm. What were you doing at Target? Do they have like formal methods over there?
Yeah, that surprised me too. They had a department. It was roughly data sciences, and it was founded by 3 mathematicians. So it was the department was started, and anyway, it was a very conducive environment for doing kind of mathematically oriented work at the time. I think it was a bit of an experiment with Target, and things have shifted since then. So at one point, it was no longer such a great place for me to be.
Oh, all right. They were interested in solving some numerical kind of stuff over there? Can you say anything about the work they are interested there?
I don't know what they're interested in anymore. It really has shifted, but they have a lot of stores and they have a huge amount of data from sales and even from cameras inside the stores. So they want to make good use of all that information. And so they were already working in Haskell before I joined. They weren't doing theorem proving kinds of stuff. They were doing functional programming. Yeah.
Right.
So functional programming gives you a clearer way to express problems that do have mathematical structure. Imperative programming is trying to describe something I'm interested in, but I'm always sort of having to describe low-level details about how to accommodate the low-level model, the von Neumann programming model, that kind of thing. Whereas if you have a problem that is kind of lends itself to being mathematicized, then it's a huge boon to have a language that's very friendly to that high level and doesn't require you to deal with a lot of distractions of like pointers and memory allocation.
So they did not have any functional programming yet?
No, they did. Yeah, they did. Yeah, yeah. So cool. I joined early on. They hired some other people as well to do that kind of thing.
Cool. All
right.
Well, with that out of the way, where do you want to begin? We have quite a few topics to discuss.
Yeah. Well, I sort of thinking roughly we could read and discuss some of the questions that people posted first.
All right.
Maybe spend, half hour, 45 minutes, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then Dan Gika joined you recently. I very much enjoyed your interview with Dan. Enjoyed both of you, and really appreciate it. So hi to Dan, and thank you very much for being on the podcast. And sharing in this conversation. I think there's a really important conversation. And I think something that Dan and I share in common is that we really want to get to the truth of things. I liked that Dan was not looking for a debate. I don't like the debate mode either. Yeah. So I think we're both really kind of interested in getting to clarity, and I appreciate his participating in it. So, maybe 45 minutes on that or something. And then the rest of the time, which hopefully is a good hour and a half at least, could be talking about examples of denotational design. So our last conversation did address philosophical points, and I think they were like important points that are underlying some of these choices, more important than how we get there. But unless people have a sense of how they can get to a place where we have clear understanding and knowledge rather than guesses about what we're engineering, unless we can give them a pathway to get there, I worry that the effect of these conversations only can be to kind of spoil their day jobs for them. In other words, they kind of awaken the desire for something better without helping them get there. So I'm hoping that today's conversation will give people more of a concrete sense of what elegant and rigorous engineering can look like, and maybe some hope about applying it in their own work.
So before we start going into some of the questions, I think Dan made a great point that is worth opening with, which is this sense of elegance, right? That is, it's sometimes seen as something very abstract, right? And it's not very clear if that's a good measure of any sense, right? Because since it's so abstract and it's not concrete, and how can you be sure, right?
Yeah, and not just not concrete, but also subjective was the word that Dan used. Yeah, and absolutely that's part of what I would like to address. I think the word is often used in that way, in a very subjective way, and that's not what I mean. Yeah, so I think I shared on the first interview a definition I like very much of elegance, and I'm going to just read that. Might as well read it, make sure that I get it right here. It was from Murray Gell-Mann. There we go. So I'm going to read this again, and I think it's kind of worth slowing down and taking it in. It's quite a concise definition. So Murray Gell-Mann, now he's a theoretical physicist, so that's the context in which he's speaking. He says, a theory appears beautiful or elegant when it is simple. In other words, when it can be expressed very concisely in terms of mathematics that we have already learned for some other reasons. Okay. So is that definition, so concise expressibility in terms of math we've already learned, not math we invented for this purpose? That's important. Because you can make anything simple, right? If you can give a very complex definition and then say, now let's take that as given and then point to it, right? So that's not a helpful notion of elegance. Yeah. And then as Dan mentioned about this notion of subjectivity, that people might use elegance to mean familiarity, and I mean definitely not that, and usually the opposite of that in practice. So that's a really important distinction. Not only isn't it not what I mean, but quite often what I'm calling elegant is the opposite of familiar to programmers. Okay, so it may be familiar to mathematicians and to theoretical physicists.
In this quote from Marie Gell-Mann, she is hinting on some sense of familiarity when she says that expressing something in terms of mathematics that you already.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So if you're a mathematician, especially a pure mathematician, then I think that's a quite useful definition. If you're a theoretical physicist, then in a sense you're also a mathematician, right? That's a useful definition. Okay. If you're a computer scientist or engineer, then unlike mathematicians, you've been made familiar with a lot of things that are not very fundamental, that are arbitrary and complex. Okay. So why, if you were brought up in engineering, if you like did software engineering as a degree or some other kind of engineering, so what makes this difference? Okay, and I think it's a difference in values between the fields. So in mathematics, it's a core value of the field to be able to express things concisely. And when you like write up a textbook, in other words, when you sort of define an area of mathematics, or when you capture an area of mathematics that has evolved, okay, the for it to pass the test that mathematicians apply, it must be quite reusable. Okay, so that's why we have abstract algebra. Abstract algebra is a very it's a very pragmatic tool, and it comes out of pragmatics that software people will relate to, which is that mathematicians found themselves doing similar sorts of work over and over. I want to prove something about natural numbers. I want to prove something about rational numbers. I find myself proving the same thing over and over. And the real numbers, oops, I do it over. And then things that aren't quite like numbers, maybe number-like complex numbers, or maybe really very number-unlike. Okay. And so I end up having to do this proof work, definition proof work, over and over. Okay, well, that's something that as software people we relate to as like reusability. That's a reusability crisis. I find myself writing the same kind of code over and over, and maybe worse, I copy and paste it because I'm so tired of typing it in, and then my eyes have glazed over, and so I don't even notice that I've copied something inappropriate together with something appropriate. In other words, I've taken too much from the cousin domain into what I'm defining. Okay, so mathematicians have our values. I mean like computer scientists and software engineers, but much more so. Those values specifically, I'm being specific values, being reuse. Okay, so a field, abstract algebra, and its subfields like ring theory or group theory or something like that, or linear algebra, which is about vector spaces, about linear functions. Okay, those fields came into being through this value system of we want to get kind of the most reusable, the most useful kind of theory that abstracts out enough but not too much. Okay. So if you are brought up with those values, okay, then Murray-Gell-Mann's definition will lead you to not subjectively, but I'm suggesting objectively elegant theories. Okay. Now, maybe I've gone a little too far to say they're objectively elegant, because maybe what I should say instead is that they are the collective subjectivity of a group of people who are darn good at making that call. Okay. Now, if you compare it with computer scientists, well, and maybe I'll avoid computer science is not a thing, right? I mean, computer science it's a funny kind of a field. But if we say like software engineers, then those software engineers, their culture, right, that forms them, what they grew up in, what their professors espoused in college, what allowed them to succeed, especially if they go into academia themselves, publishing papers. Okay, their values are not really the same as mathematicians. If they go into industry, I should say, they're especially not the same because they're rewarded for more short-term value. All right, and Dan kind of made this point too when he said operational semantics is the workhorse of the programming language theory community, programming language theory, right? And I agree that is the case. I don't take that as being a statement of a strength of operational semantics. I take it to be a statement of the weakness of the current community, from which I hope they will recover. Okay, but capitalism moves people into doing short-term value work, right? So just crank it out, add the next feature, pass the tests, but don't think too deeply beyond that, right? So those values do not give rise to what? If you have those values, then what you are familiar with is not going to be what Murray-Gell-Mann was talking about. If your values are the formal, so the precise simplicity. The simplicity is the important part. The reason I say precise is that without precise, simplicity is usually a lie. In other words, it means if somebody doesn't understand a system formally, precisely, then when they say it's simple, they just mean I don't understand the complexity of it.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, because they're coming out of ignorance. If they had to make it precise, they would know the actual measure of complexity. Okay.
This comes back to the example of Python and the runtime. We just don't know how extremely complex things are.
Yeah, you don't know how complex it is. All you know is that you're used to it and you can survive more or less as well as you're expected to in your current job. That kind of thing. Yeah. Yeah. So to rewind a bit, so Murray-Gell-Mann isn't saying what he did say is we consider a theory elegant, beautiful or elegant, if it can be expressed concisely in terms of mathematics we've already discovered for some other reason. He's not saying if it can be expressed in terms of the latest web framework that some committee got together and after weeks of compromise, right, and everybody's will to live was beaten down, they kind of came up with this document, right? He's not talking about that kind of thing. He's not talking about what you learned even in school, because unfortunately, what people are learning in school in our field is less and less fundamental. Like MIT, of course, used to teach computer science based on scheme. Not my favorite choice, but it's way, way closer to my favorite choice than what they're doing now, which is Python. My understanding of why they made that switch is because companies want Python programmers. So it's really capitalism that it kind of, it's capitalism that applied the pressure, and it's MIT that caved to the pressure, rather than what I think a university can do uniquely well, which is to move scientific progress forward and to help the students become aware of the difference between work of lasting scientific value versus what you can get paid for. Yeah. So there's really important qualifications in Murray-Gell-Mann's definition, and one of them is this in terms of mathematics. Now, I would make that more specific. Okay, I would say I think it's what he meant. I think it's in the spirit of what he meant. Okay, but I would say if it can be formalized in a proof assistant very concisely in terms of mathematics that we've learned for other very good reasons, mathematically sound, things that apply to a lot of different uses. Okay, not hacked up for this application domain. Okay, so I'm suggesting a more stringent reading. If you're a theoretical physicist, I think Murray-Gell-Mann's definition is fine because you already have those values. But if you're not, if you kind of have been shaped by engineering, then anybody who's shaped by engineering is going to kind of have a rut that they're going to be tending to fall into, and that rut is not going to be what Murray-Gell-Mann is talking about. It's going to be more like, well, Google did this, so it's a good idea, or this is one of the 1,000 papers that was published in in some machine learning conference, this year, and so it must be good. So I think it's very easy to deceive ourselves, and that's why formality matters. That's the reason formality matters. Because if you're not going to get away with lying to Koch or Agda or Idris or Lean. Okay. If you get it to come to a false conclusion, it's because you've explicitly given it a false postulate. Okay. So you've had to own up to that, and then everything you've proved is like modulo these assumptions. And if those assumptions are false, fine, it's false. Okay, but with a lower standard than that, including well-intentioned people, but probably people who are under some kind of pressure, and that can be academic pressure, like publication and tenure, or it could be commercial pressure. We've got to get the customers are demanding, or on the other side, like my own performance review is coming up, and I know my boss is expecting that he can check off this box to give to his boss, and so on. Those pressures are going to be pushing us away from the values that Murray-Gell-Mann is talking about. Yeah. So I would say elegance is not mainly a subjective kind of a thing, or if it is, it's the subjectivity of a group of people in whom I place trust to make that call, mathematicians and theoretical physicists. Yeah, I don't trust software engineers to make that call.
How would you reconcile then? Because now you put I don't know. I feel like it's very hard to reconcile this idea of the pressures of the world, because at the end of the day we live in a capitalism society, in a capitalist society, and you have to deliver something, right? You have to. It comes back in a sense to that question that I made you last episode, where you had this really hard problem, and you're under pressure, right? You were under pressure to do the easy solution, and you're like, no, I'm not doing the easy solution. I'm going all the way. And then I ask you, what if you didn't find? You would have been kicked out, and you're like, yeah, most likely, right?
It's an uncomfortable position, and it's a position I've been in many times.
Sure, but
there's often a gap between when I know that a suggestion is going to lead down a nightmare alley and when I have a better suggestion. There's often a gap between the two. There's just always a gap between those two. Now, a lot of people are not willing to speak when they're in that gap. They feel uncomfortable with something that's being proposed, but they don't have a better solution. And a lot of people don't want to hear it. A lot of people don't want to hear from somebody else. They're like, this doesn't, we should take a few days off and really think about this before jumping in with both feet. So I think it's a part of adult life for anybody who cares about improving the state, the state of the art. So what do you do? This is a very personal question, and I'm happy to address it. I just want to say I'm not going to give everybody a kind of dictate about what's the morally right thing to do, because the consequences are on the individual. Okay. So first of all, I want to say everybody has a choice. Okay. So it's not, so when people say, I don't have a choice, I'm being forced to do this, it's not true. Okay. There are consequences to making choices. Okay. So I'm going to make a choice. I'm going to be informed by what my values are and what I think the consequences of my choice are. Okay. It's still a choice. That's personal responsibility. That's part of being an adult and part of being honest about things. Okay. So for me personally, I have, I think I could have got a lot more promotions and raises, and various forms of external affirmation by not rocking the boat and making incremental improvements to, what was going on in my jobs, by suggesting non-radical improvements, by suggesting modest improvements that are within people's mental paradigms. I have chosen not to do that quite consistently, and there's been a personal cost in doing so. But those are my values. We have a very brief window, right, to do anything that will have an impact on the world. So there's you got maybe 80 years plus or minus 10, something like that. It's getting longer. On the other hand, well, no, it was getting longer until a few years ago, and now it's not. I'm sorry about that. So we have that window, and then a lot of that window is occupied by other stuff. I'm like a little kid, and I'm learning to write, learning my ABCs, and then maybe I am a young married and start having children, and maybe I have a mortgage and that kind of stuff. There are these different parts of life where where we have different pressures on us, but we always have this choice. So to me, it's become very clear. I think I always had a direction, but I think I got more clear about it in the last couple of years. And what the it is that's gotten more clear is that I want to do more than Brownian motion. I want to participate in something more than Brownian motion. Okay, so what I mean is like the whole universe is wiggles. Right, that's what the universe is. The universe is wiggles. You look at every particle is wiggling. Every subatomic particle is wiggling. Right. We have our breathing in and out. We have the day rhythm. We have the sun going around the galactic center. We have all of these cycles. Right. That's the universe is made out of wiggles. We as a species have a kind of special opportunity. I don't think we're the only intelligent species even on this planet, but we're a particularly intelligent species. And with that, we can make certain choices and we can create things of lasting value. Okay. And we look back on the last particularly few hundred years. Okay. So what I mean is since the age of enlightenment and the age of science, I don't want to discount what happened before. There was a very dark period before where the church ran things, and then there was an enlightened period before with the Greeks, the golden age of Greece. But if we focus on the last few hundred years, we have made phenomenal progress in understanding a large questions. Where are we in the universe? What is the universe? Our picture today is radically different from what it was before. We've learned very, very important things. We learned important things about life too. We've learned that almost all species that have ever lived are now extinct, and also that that's a good thing, not a bad thing for progress, for the genetic progress of what's happening, with life on this planet. Okay, so for the last few hundred years, before the last few hundred years, we were doing kind of Brownian motion. There was a lot of intensity and there was a lot of energy going into things like theology, okay? A lot of complicated theories, and none of those theories really could go anywhere, could produce anything of lasting value, okay? The scientific method gave us a way to steer toward the truth, okay? By emphasizing experimentation, which is you have to measure a theory against reality, right? And then we learned how to where to look for theories, how to test those theories. We test those theories. It tells us where else to look for theories, and we look there. They tell us what else to test. So we've been doing this for a while and making phenomenal progress, and it's incredible. We're doing something of great value. We are almost a multiplanetary species. That's incredibly important. We may or may not be the only. Our planet may or may not be the only home for intelligent life. I used to think that was a simple question. Obviously is. I no longer think that for a variety of reasons. I don't know which way. I really hope we're not it, but we might be. So anyway, I think we're in the position to do things that really matter in the long term. Okay, capitalism is not pushing us in that direction. Capitalism is pushing us towards short-term value. That's what runs it. Okay, so what do you do as an individual, I think is your question. What do I do? How then do I live? All right. And I think that's where you got to make a choice. How much do you care about doing work of lasting value? Okay. Work of lasting value is based on, there are certain choices that one makes strategically to do that. And skepticism about well-established institutions, holy books, Gang of Four design patterns, JavaScript frameworks,
creator of languages,
TensorFlow stuff, these kind of things. That's not of lasting value. They're kind of complex piles of things that sort of do a job. So if you really care about being part of I was going to say the human experiment, but I'm going to say the experiment of intelligence, what intelligence can accomplish. Okay, if you really care about that and you want your life to make a difference, if you want to be part of creating something of lasting value rather than of short-term monetary gain, then I think you got to make a sacrifice. How much of a sacrifice is up to you.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I have chosen to do work that is important to me, rather than trying to maximize my bonuses and raises and that kind of thing. And I'm glad. And it's not always, it hasn't always been pleasant.
I think your stoicism is very inspiring, sticking to what you believe. So thank you. Thank you for sharing that with us. Moving a little forward a little bit, bringing the next topic of what Dan has raised about operational semantics as a way to ensure computability.
I think I'm not quite done with the elegance thing, especially if we're going to, to address Dan's comments. I think the thing that impressed me the most when I listened to Dan's, with your conversation with Dan, is that he and I really agree. I think Dan and I really agree much more than he realizes. I think Dan really believes in elegance. He just calls it different things. Dan talked about, what elegance should not be a yardstick of success for science. Okay. And I agree with him. And it's not my yardstick. It has value. And I think Dan expressed that value. So one of the things Dan said is, instead of subjective criteria, science, progresses by examining objective criteria, and that's what we should do too. And objective criteria, like something's faster or cheaper, or it's easily formalizable. Okay, so faster, cheaper, or easily formalizable. I think what he calls easily formalizable is what I call elegance. I think it's really the same thing, and that we value it for the very same pragmatic reasons. So elegance is a means to an end. It's not an end to itself. Okay, it is a little bit for some people, including me. I mean, I have like a pleasure response to elegance. But I don't think it needs to be justified at all on those grounds. So if something is inelegant, it cannot be formalized with ease. So formalization becomes very costly for something that is complex. If the proof is complex, then proving becomes very difficult. If the theorem is complex, it's actually a different problem. It's not that it's difficult. It's not that it's costly to create. It's that it's of less value. Because a theorem is a question, right, and a proof is an answer. So, is this true? Yes. Here's the evidence, right? Or can something be done in polynomial time? Yes. Here's me demonstrating it in proof that it's correct and it's in polynomial time. All right. So there's a question. There's an answer. The answer can be verified by a machine. That's what a proof assisted is. Okay. The question cannot be verified by a machine. Right? It doesn't have the property of being right or wrong. The answer does. The question doesn't. Questions have a property of being more useful and less useful. Okay. And then there is another kind of right or wrong thing about it, which is really important, and it's why it has to be simple. Which is, if I have a very complicated statement of a theorem, and then I want to go and apply it, right? That's the point. I prove things so that I can use them. But if the very statement of the theorem is complex, okay, then my trying to apply it, especially in my head, is going to be difficult, right? And the machine that's checking that proof is me, and I'm bad at that. And so are you. We all are. You and I are among the best at it, and we are bad at it. Okay? So questions are not formalized, and therefore they must be simple because we deal with them informally. Anything that's complicated is probably false. Okay? Anything that's complicated is both probably false and is capable of fooling most of us. Therefore, anything that's complicated has to be formally checked in order to be trusted. If questions by their nature cannot be formally checked, there's no question to check the question with, right? Then we cannot use formality. Therefore, we have to use simplicity instead. Okay. So it's a purely pragmatic. If I want trustworthy results, and the question here is, I think a fundamental question is, can we build engineering artifacts, sophisticated engineering artifacts that are dependable? I think that's a question, and that's what proof lets us get to. Okay, if we find a way to make that proof the proof have manageable effort, and the theorem be manageably simple. Okay, so I don't care how hard it is to check the proof. The machine is doing that. I care how hard it is to build a proof because that's the cost of it, and I care how simple the theorem is because that's the value of it. So Dan is the same. I mean, he likes the same thing. It's like, I want it to be easily formalized, and that's what he liked, I think, about his the string diagrams and the graph incarnation of his string diagrams. They were easy to formalize, and that was the thing that he valued about it. And I'm cheering him on. Good for you, brother.
I think one of the issues here is that within his definition of elegance, you mentioned cost, right? And I believe there is a duality here in the sense of simplicity is costly.
Simplicity is costly to find.
Exactly. It takes a lot of effort, mental churning of the brain, right?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Simplicity is difficult to
so
attain.
These two forces within elegance of simplicity and cost are actually contending with each other at all times.
Okay, right. Let's get into that. Thank you. Yeah, thanks. Yeah. So I was talking about a different cost. I was talking about the cost of use. So if something is complex, then its usage cost, every user gets taxed by that complexity. Okay. If something is difficult to create, then its creator pays that cost and everybody else benefits from it. Yeah. So think about Einstein, right? Einstein spent 10 years between the special and general theories of relativity, right? He spent 10 years to bridge that gap, and that's what he was working on. right? And he came up with a great answer that we have all benefited from ever since. And we benefited from his earlier theory, special theory of relativity. We've benefited from his proof of the existence of atoms, right? His explanation of the photoelectric effect. We've all benefited from these things. Einstein paid the cost. We get the benefit. Okay. And his theories are simple. They're elegant in the sense of Murray Gell-Mann. Now, Einstein had to be educated, exposed, and sensitive enough to be aware of some mathematics, like the mathematics of Werner Riemann, of higher dimensional geometry and topology. But he was, thank goodness, and he had a teacher, Minkowski, who exposed him to that and who helped him with that kind of work. So it's not like it's for free. But I think that this is an important distinction. If we don't need a world full of brilliant people creating simple things, we need a few people doing that, right? And for them to be valued and supported, and then we need some education to appreciate. And Dijkstra pointed out, simplicity requires education to appreciate.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of people don't have that, so that's kind of a bummer. Because they don't even recognize when you hand it to them, and they're not jumping up and down to thank the inventor either. They're more like maybe annoyed that I'm asking you to think of something that isn't part of your JavaScript framework.
But on the other hand, I think then made a point last when he was here, and that was very, how can I put it? I felt a lot at ease because he mentions that it only takes one person to appreciate your work. If one person, and I found so much.
Good. I'm glad you did.
He's so right. He's so right. It only takes, one person, especially in academia. If this one person will see the value of what you're doing, you're done. That's all you need.
It's not all everybody needs. Yeah. I think, but it's a hell of a big difference between 0 and 1. Yeah. Some people want constant affirmation. Other people don't care at all, and other people like, just give me 1, for goodness sake, just
right,
1.
Exactly. Makes me think of Lean. It only took, if I'm not mistaken, it only took one big mathematician to really appreciate Lean, and now Lean is growing so exponentially because of his voice.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's a big world, and now we have like what you and I are doing now, talking to each other in long distance. Yeah. And so we can get connection and some affirmation for work without it being popular in terms of like ratios. If only 1% or 1/100% of people appreciate this, that's plenty now. You didn't used to be. Yeah. So I'd like to go back to another, since we're talking about Dan's remarks and elegance. So I really think Dan and I are very close in what we value. When I use the word elegance, he uses the word easily formalizable, and I think that's the heart of it. And I'm happy with describing it either way. I actually like his way of saying easily formalizable, because he's right. It has to be objective. Otherwise, it's just too slippery, and that. Easily formalizable. So formalizable, I think is really kind of the best. It's the best yardstick we have, because that's the one in which we're not deceived. I think everything else that's looser than that is just inviting self-deception. So there was another thing that surprised me, and I'm also grateful to Dan about. I think I was surprised that some of his objections around elegance was of the form. It's not enough. Elegance is not a good enough definition of success. And so, like, he pointed out, the Greeks thought that the orbits were circular, and circle's more elegant than an ellipse, and they were wrong. And it took Kepler to notice that, but it took telescopes, right? Our ability to observe things. And then and I completely agree with that. It's elegance is not a yardstick for success. Truth, right? Truth is the yardstick. And in science, truth means it agrees with reality.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
So the problem with circles is they didn't agree with reality. They're disqualified, not just for Dan, but for me too. All right. So if a theory doesn't agree with the facts, then the theory, we throw it out. Now, sometimes there's some subtlety to it, which is that we can make mistakes in our measurements. And there have been theories, and there have been people who believed in those theories, for which the theory disagreed with measurements that have been taken. And there was something about those theories that were so compelling that we went back and remeasured, and the measurements were wrong. Okay, so Frank Wilczek talks about some examples of these. Murray Gell-Mann does too. I think maybe I linked to a talk that he gave. Yeah, where here we had this beautiful theory. There were like 7 experiments published that showed we were wrong, and they were wrong. We were right. Our one theory was right. All those 7 experiments were wrong. Now, I'm not saying this is like school kids facing off in the playground saying I'm right and you're wrong. I mean, those experiments were redone and found to be mistaken the first time. So occasionally there are theories that are so compelling. But you know what? We don't even have to talk about that. I'm perfectly happy saying if it doesn't agree with reality, it's disqualified. Now, of theories that agree with reality, what shall we pick? And Dan and I have the same answer. We pick the simpler ones, right? And I think how Dan put it was, if all else is equal, yeah, sure, let's do the simpler things. That's all I'm saying. But of course, all else is equal. I think what we both mean, not literally everything else is equal, because it won't be. I think what we really literally mean is it does the job. It agrees with reality. Okay. Now, for computation, there's something also that we put in, and he mentioned this, which is efficiency. So Dan said, elegance isn't worth a 50 times hit in efficiency. All right. So if your elegant thing is 50 times slower than this inelegant thing, then you should go with the inelegant thing. I completely agree with him on that. So I really think this was part of what I was struck in listening to him was like, wow, we really agree more than I thought we did and more than he thinks we do. So, and for me, and somebody asked me this in a sort of like a job conversation. It was a company who wanted to hire me to help them design hardware. And the CEO asked me this question and was like, okay, so you want to do this proofs, but how much does it cost you in performance? Because performance really matters. And I was taken aback, a bit by the question. It's not the first time I heard the question, but maybe I was in a more clear space when I heard it this time. Because there's something really broken about that question. How much performance does proof lose? Okay. So for one thing, proof cannot lose performance because it has nothing to do with performance. So there are different kinds of things. Proof is about whether it's correct or not. Performance is about the detail, the operational details, right? How efficiently you can map it to physics, right? So physics is out there doing what it does. We've kind of tamed it in the form of first analog and then digital electronics, right? But it's still physics, of course, which means, of course, it's still analog. But we have this kind of simulation of digital computation that we use. Okay, then we want to use it efficiently. Okay, so but to say that like proof is at odds, I think what it really means, there's 2 questions. Okay, is it proof that's the problem, or is it truth that's the problem? Okay, in other words, do you want to eliminate proof because you don't want to have to do the work of having a proof? Or do you want to eliminate proof because you don't want the inconvenience of dealing with the fact that your implementation is wrong? Okay? Because proof has these 2 aspects. There's a fundamental aspect, and that's really what proof is about, what's motivated, which is it allows us to safely arrive at the truth. Let me say that differently. It prevents us from deluding ourselves that we have arrived at the truth when we have not. And that's what proof does. Proof either it tells you one of 2 things. You haven't gotten there yet, right? You haven't finished your proof. Or you've actually gotten there, really. Okay. Informal arguments make you think you've gotten to the answer when you haven't. You've gotten to truth when you have not. That's why proof is so important. Okay. So if I care about truth, right, then proof can only be an asset. Now it costs some, but that's not the cost of proof. That's the cost of knowing that I'm right about this thing that I'm betting perhaps tens of millions of dollars on, as in the case of hardware or even software,
Right.
really. Yeah. Billions and billions of dollars, like Intel paid for their buggy floating point kind of bug, right? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, there's a cost to doing that, and there's a huge benefit, and you do this kind of risk ratio, and some things we just don't bother. Some things we do. Okay. Now, so that's why I'm saying it cannot possibly be a detraction from performance, okay, unless what you're really trying to do is get rid of the property of being correct. Okay, when you eliminate truth, right? If you really want to get rid of the requirement to being correct, then by all means, yes, you can do much better performance-wise. No matter what your implementation is, you can do much better. And until you get to the limit, which is that it's infinitely fast and takes no resources. And the only problem with that implementation is that it's wrong. But hey, you said you wanted to give up truth, right? It was too costly for you. Okay. So I think you got to decide, do you want it to be right or not? If you don't want it to be right, then you can get absolute ideal efficiency very, very easily. You just erase everything and you're done. Okay. It runs infinitely fast. Okay. And it has no known bugs. Right? All right. If you want to get it right, then proof cannot hurt you. And now I want to say something stronger, which is that it can help you, and also it's essential for performance. So it's not an enemy of performance; it's an essential ally for performance. And here's why. This is something I've seen my whole career. So I graduated my PhD in 1989. So I've been doing working since then and before then actually. All right. So what I've seen my whole career is that people optimize their software to a certain point, and that point is it's now so complex. And my grip on its correctness is so shaky that I don't dare optimize it any further.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
That's the phenomenon I've seen my entire career. And what I learned by watching this happen is that optimization is self-defeating if done without proof. Okay? So we engineers, I consider myself one, we engineers care about two things. We care about this thing actually does what I want, or what my customers want, and it also does it cheaply. Okay, nowadays cheap is not just about speed, it's mostly about energy, and you cannot get speed without having low energy. If you have low energy, you get more than you get with just speed. Okay? So we care about it being reliable, roughly it being right, but I don't even mean in the sense proof, and we care about it being efficient with the resources. Okay? Now, without proof, those two things that we deeply care about are at odds with each other. Okay? This is a terrible situation. If there are two things you deeply care about, you don't want them at odds with each other, because it means whenever you help one, you hurt the other. And that's exactly what we do now. That is the state of the art. Okay? So I can make my program more likely to be dependable by making it less efficient. Oops. I can make it more efficient by making it less dependable. Oops. That's what it means to take two of your core values and put them at odds with each other. And that's the state of computer science and engineering today. Okay? So I think we cannot get away from that terrible dilemma without proof. Proof is the solution. Okay? So when I said that proof is not only is it not the enemy of efficiency, it's the necessary ally of efficiency. That's what I mean. Without proof, you can only get so far before you're no longer willing to increase the likelihood of catastrophic failure beyond what you've already done. Right? There becomes a point where it says nobody's willing. The performance, the efficiency, the low cost is no longer worth the increased likelihood of catastrophic failure. Okay.
It seems to me that
so how you get past that is you have a proof.
Right. It seems to me that this proofs in this case is almost as if it's a specification of your understanding of how the program works, right? Like, because as you're improving and increasing the optimization, you are increasing complexity in a way. Like
yes.
it's doing more and more things, but at the same time, you're kind of like you're not. There are too many internal states of how your program is working, and you're not properly documenting on how each one of these states is actually talking with each other. And what the proofs forces you to do is to properly document it in a proof state, right?
It forces you to properly document it and be right. And probably you're not right, even. Not only have you documented it, you're probably actually wrong. And so the effort to prove something does more than confirms that it's right. It actually makes it be right when it was wrong. It reveals the mistakes. Because that's one of the wonderful properties of proof. We think of proof as about, this is how you verify something that's right. But proof has another effect. It's how you constructively anti-verify something that's wrong, right? And that's a necessary step on getting to the truth. All right? Like you probably heard this saying, it's a cliche. Would you rather be right or happy? Because it's not usually talked about in our field. It's usually talked about like in marriage counseling or something like that. Would you rather be right or happy? Okay. I don't buy that dichotomy. I think stable happiness depends on becoming right. To me, a more constructive question is, would I like to appear to be right, or would I like to become right? Okay? And proof is the ally of becoming right, and it's the enemy of appearing to be already right. So you got to ask yourself a personal question. What's more important to me, the truth or other people thinking I'm already there? And for some people, it's one, and some people, it's the other. And type systems, including the extreme of like proof is independent type systems, are all about telling you you're wrong when you're wrong. Some people appreciate that information and some people don't.
Maybe I'm doing a leap of thought here now, but it seems to me that this is, in a sense, the core of what denotational design and what your philosophy behind denotational design is happening. Is this the case? Is this where we're going?
What do you think is the it that's the core of denotational design?
The it, it's exactly this idea of documenting your
yes.
your code with your proofs, right? In a sense of you can only understand your code properly if they are accompanied by their proofs.
Okay, so I want to say almost. Yeah, and I want to make a distinction. I think it's pretty important because they're like two different groups of people it impacts and two different values it impacts. So one is the statement of the theorem, and the other is the proof. Okay, so I don't understand the functionality of my software unless I understand the statement of the theorem. Okay, the statement of the theorem is the functionality of my software.
Specification. Yep.
Yes, exactly. The specification. Yeah. So the proof brings in the implementation details. Okay. Right. So I'm going to have some big wad of code, and I'm going to have a theorem, and I'm going to have a proof. So the theorem says, yes, the code is faithful to some specification, and that specification should not be the code itself. Otherwise, it's not useful. Okay. And then there's a third thing that says this claim is true. That's the proof. Okay. So if you want to understand the functionality, so for instance, a user or an implementer want to understand, what this functionality is, then they should only need the theorem, not the proof. Okay. But now you want to make sure the implementation is correct, right? So if I design some software, that's what I've done my whole career. I design some software and I give it to you, and you're the user. I want to be able to tell you a story about the software that is not about its implementation. Okay, that is about how you can use it, how you can think about it. Okay, that's the story. And I want that story to be true in the sense of the following sense. My implementation, which is the thing I'm actually going to give you. So there's a story and the implementation. The story, the specification, the implementation is different from that. The theorem is that the implementation is faithful to the story. That's the theorem. If that theorem holds, then you can use that story and ignore the implementation without hurting yourself. Okay. If that theorem is not true, okay, then my story will hurt you eventually. Okay, I've given you a little story. I'm saying that there's the birds and the bees, or the stork, or the earth goes around the sun goes around the earth, or something like that. There's some story, and eventually, like if you believe that story, you're going to hurt yourself because it's in conflict with reality. Okay. So the purpose of the theorem and the proof, purpose of the theorem is the statement of the theorem is to give you a simpler story. The purpose of the proof is to make sure you don't hurt yourself, to make sure that you can just focus on the simple story and not on the implementation. All right. And the two will be exactly analogous. Okay. In other words, the implementation is faithful. That's what the theorem says. Okay. If I have proved that theorem, and you know that theorem is proved, and you're the user, you don't have to look at the proof. Okay? So the complex proof does not cost you, the user, more. It costs the prover more, right? If it's complicated, okay? What does cost you, the user, more is the complexity of the theorem. That's why I keep making that distinction. That's hugely important. Because if you write some software and you share it, it's because you think there's going to be probably more users than authors, right? Maybe it had 2 or 3 authors, and maybe it's got 10 million users, or maybe it only has 3,000. Who cares? Or 15. All right, but there's more of them presumably, and therefore I want to make their job easier, and I'm willing to make my job harder in order to make their job easier. Economy of scale, right? That is my job. So what makes your job easier is for the theorem to be simple. That's why elegance. That's what I mean by elegance. That a precisely stated theorem, and I don't even mean the proof, I mean the theorem. Okay, if that theorem can be expressed very concisely in terms of mathematics we've already learned for some other purpose, right? And preferably, if I'm giving it to a user, preferably something I can refer to that they know about, or I just really keep it simple, right? Then I've given them something of more value than if I'd given them something with a complex specification. Because every time they go to use it, they have to think of the story I've given them. And there's 3 possibilities. The story is very complex, in which case they're going to struggle with it. Okay, it's going to be painful every time they use it. Or the story is simple but false, in which case they're going to be misled and hurt themselves with it. Or the story is simple and true. That's what I'm after, and that's what I mean by the word elegant. And that's why it matters. It's a very practical sort of a thing. Okay. Now, on the other hand, I want my proof to be elegant. Why? Because the more complicated it is, the harder I'm going to have to work, the harder it is, or whoever builds it. Yeah. But that's a cost that I'm willing to pay. Okay. But I'm not willing to make it unnecessarily difficult. Okay. And in particular, I'm not willing to get a poor result and make it unnecessarily difficult. And I'm afraid that's what operational semantics leads people to do. Okay, and we can talk more about operational semantics, that it neither gives a good implementation, a high quality result, nor a simple story. Okay, and we can come back to that one. And it's really, whether you agree with that or not, it's not important. I think what's really important is that there are these 2 values. I want to give something of high value, and I want to make it cost effective to create. I want it to have high value in 2 senses. I give them something that's efficient in their use of resources because they're running on their machine, right? And also they're running on this planet. We all share this planet, and how much heat is dissipated by a computer affects everything that lives on this planet, right? And it affects you more than me because you're younger, right? And my grandkids, right? This is a serious thing. This matters. Yeah. So I want to give something that's easy for them to understand. And let me put a point on that. Not easy for them to understand, easy for them to understand reliably. Okay. So a false story can be easy to understand, but it does you harm to understand it that way. So that's why I want simple and correct. Yeah. So correct is what proof gives you. Simple is what elegance gives you. And that elegance is of value to the end user. The elegance of the theorem. Yeah. That's why it matters. And I know Dan has, I know Dan agrees with me on the essentials of that. We may have different ideas about the strategies, but that's a good thing. That's a good thing because there's let's do our experiments as long as we're asking the same questions. Yeah, and sharing our challenges and our successes honestly with each other, not trying to win a debate.
Yeah. I like that. So I think at this point, I probably disappointed our listeners because I said that we wanted to do a more concrete episode, and we're 1 hour in, very philosophical still, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I was thinking maybe we want to get a little more concrete on those examples of denotational design, because most of the questions that we have is somehow related to that.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah, we'll maybe come back and touch on some of these philosophical points, but not rest there, just touch there. Yeah, because they are important, but they're also hard to know what to do without the concrete.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. So so I've been using denotational design consciously for the last 15 years or something like that, where I could articulate it, and I think now I can articulate it better than I could then. But I think I was using it my whole career, since the late '80s. There's something that clicked for me, and it shaped what I built. And I've worked in computer graphics, but I worked in other areas, and I think it's really the kind of paradigm of how do you think about these things we're building in a useful and powerful way. And again, my goal has always been high performance, always. So I'm not somebody who cares about elegance more than performance. I care about and proof more than performance. I care about them together, and I think they only work when they're together. They don't work apart from each other. Yeah. So anyway, so let's talk about some examples of denotational design. Okay. Well, maybe what denotational design is a little bit, but mostly in terms of examples. Okay. So what I mean by denotational design is this. That there's a precise analogy, okay, between, this is what I was just saying, there's a precise analogy between a simple, precise story and an implementation. Okay. Now that precise analogy looks like, sometimes it's called compositional semantics. In a more specific form, the same essence, but in a more specific form, it's called homomorphic design or homomorphism. And it's the idea. If you think about what is software for, right? It's to solve some kind of a problem, and hopefully that problem isn't one that we created by using computers, right? Right? Computers are supposed to be a net win, right? That's like, right? We shouldn't just use computers to like solve computer problems, because a much easier solution is just get rid of all the computers, right? So we have computers because we're trying to solve computer problems that don't originate from the computers themselves, right? So they're going to be outside, all right? But we're going to use the computer. Right? And outside, we might have things like numbers and trees and graphs and language, right? Probability distributions, that kind of thing. Computers aren't any of those things. They're not even numbers, right? Computers are patterns of bits. Even that's not true, because bits are digital and computers are analog. That is going to sound weird to some people, but to realize computers are analog, you just have to ask, what are they made out of? They're made out of nature, and nature is analog, right? So computers, everything in nature is analog in this sense. There's another question about like the Planck threshold, like at 10 to the minus 43 seconds and 10 to the minus 30 something meters, or something like that, right? Where there's an open question of, is the universe discrete or continuous? I think that's a really interesting question, but what? Our computers cannot run anywhere near at that rate. Why? Because they're made out of nature. Nothing they made out of nature can run at nature's own rate, right? Therefore, if you're saying I'm trying to model reality, and reality has this Planck level discreteness, then I have to tell you that every implementation you could possibly build in this universe has to be wrong, because none of them could run at the right rate, because the correct rate, the way you've defined it, is the Planck rate, which is unachievable in a universe that's built on the Planck length, threshold itself. So I think this whole thing about the discreteness of nature at that level is really interesting, but I think it's like it's a red herring in conversations about software or hardware that we can come within many, many, many orders of magnitude, of building.
So maybe just to give some more context, there was a question talking exactly about this. He was asking, wait, no, but we know that nature is actually discrete,
yes,
right?
But that's right. Yeah. I forgot that came up. Yeah. So yes, nature is discrete, and if you say, then what you're doing is you're acting like nature. Okay, well, nature is not only discrete; it has a particular frame rate, particular sampling rate.
Oh, the frame
so that's
rate.
Your job.
That's kind of like what this Planck constant is about. Is how
you have to run it. I think it's like 10 to the minus 43, something like that. seconds.
Okay. Gotcha.
So you got to run your software on your hardware that gets that rate. Guess what? Not even any hardware built in this universe can run at that rate, because it's made out of this universe.
Exactly. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you want to say nature is discrete, then I'm going to say, okay, it's not all discrete. It's telling you what rate to run at, and it's impossible even theoretically. So good luck with that. Okay. So now we can back off and say, maybe even from a modest Newtonian perspective. Okay. Well, there the universe is continuous. No, let me say that differently. I bungled that one. So Newton and Leibniz gave a continuous model of the universe, continuous time and space, right? Now, maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong about that continuous thing. Okay, but if they're wrong, and the nature really does have this discreteness in time and space, then the continuous model is incredibly more faithful to that discrete truth than any discrete model we could possibly work with, than we could possibly implement. Okay. All right. If you look at the step size, what's my step size? In one case, it's 0. That's the continuous model. And the other, and the truth is 10 to the minus 43. And then what everybody else is doing is like 10 to the minus 6 or something. It's like absurdly inaccurate. Okay, maybe 10 to the minus 12 if you're lucky. But like 0 is so much closer to the truth. The infinite frame rate is so much closer to the truth than any frame rate that you could possibly, build on with today's technology. And I think also anyone in this universe. Yeah. So if you want to talk about faithfulness, if you want to talk about proximity to the truth, the continuous model is much, much more faithful to a quantum discrete reality than anything that we could build out of nature. Okay, so that's my answer to that question. Okay, so now let's go back to denotational design. I was saying we want to use computers to build analogies between some non-computational, some non-computer thing, I should say. All right, and a computer. Okay, so we have to use we got to decide at what level we're going to talk about the reality of the computer. And I was mentioning the reality of the computer is analog or quantum discrete. Okay, neither one of those, right, are how we program. We program with a digital abstraction. That's fine. So let's just be honest and say we're not talking about reality. We're talking about a digital abstraction. It's fine. Okay, so within that digital abstraction, it's bits, it's not numbers, it's not trees, it's not graphs, it's bits and bits patterns, okay? So how can I possibly solve a question? How can I possibly answer a question about numbers or trees or graphs or mathematical functions or relations, right? Or probability distributions by using this thing that's a pattern of bits. They're like, it's a category error. They're different kinds of things, okay? And the answer is, you make an analogy, okay? But it's not analogy in the way most people use the word. Most people use the word analogy in a very sloppy way, right? So it's kind of resembles, and if you look too closely, it breaks down. That's an example of what I meant by a harmful fiction, right? So you say, this thing is like this other much simpler thing, and then after a few days, you find out that you're wondering, like, what the heck? I can't explain this behavior. And you come back to me and I say, well, it's because I lied to you and you believe me. Right? So in order to like do no harm, right? We have to use precise analogies. We have to use truthful analogies. Okay. So in mathematics, we have developed, over the last few hundred years, we've developed a notion of a precise, exact analogy, and that's called homomorphism. Okay. So homomorphism means this: you have a language, okay. And you're going to apply that language in two different settings. Okay? So, for example, I'll take groups. So the idea of a group in mathematics is you have some associative operation with an identity and an inverse. Okay, and it satisfies certain laws. The identity is the identity with respect to the binary operation, associative operation, and the inverse is the inverse. If you combine a thing with the inverse, you get the identity. Okay, so that's what a group is. And there are a whole bunch of groups out there. Rational numbers, real numbers are groups. Symmetry groups, the kind of spatial transformations you can apply to something, or even non-spatial transformation. You apply to something, and then you get kind of out what you got in to a certain level of examination. Symmetry is a group. You can compose them. That's the multiplication, so to speak, and you can undo them, do them backwards. That's the inverse. Okay. Anyway, there are a lot of these things. Okay. Now, so there's in particular, there's more than one of them. So now you can ask the question, take two of these groups and you can ask how they relate, okay? And I want to relate them by an analogy. I want to use one of them to tell a story about the other one, okay? So you get where I'm going here. We're talking about engineering, okay? So let me make a simpler example. Instead of a group that has an inverse, I'm going to do a monoid, okay? So a monoid is just something that has an operation that's associative and it has an identity. It doesn't necessarily have an inverse. So if you think about in programming, there are a bunch of monoids come up. One of them is numbers, natural numbers, with 0 and addition. Okay, so addition is associative and 0 is the identity. Done, you qualify. Okay, another thing comes up in programming is, let's say, lists, even strings. Strings being like a list of characters, whether implemented that way or not. Okay, so we have natural numbers and we have strings. I'll call it. Okay, strings form another monoid. The associative operation, the one I'm thinking of, is concatenation, and the identity is the empty string. Okay, so here we have two monoids. They speak the same language, associative operation with identity. They both obey the laws. Now, are they related to each other in any interesting way? Well, yes, they are. If you take the length of a string, you get a natural number. Okay? But it's much more intimately related than that, the two, which is that the length of the empty string is 0. In other words, the length of the identity is the identity. The length of the concatenation is the sum of the lengths. Okay? So length is a homomorphism between two monoids, the monoid of strings and the monoid of natural numbers. Okay? There are a bunch of homomorphisms. Slide rules. You're too young. I'm almost too young, but I learned to use a slide rule when I was a kid because I had older brothers and they had slide rules, and I was curious. Slide rules are a mechanical way of doing computation. Okay. Well, the clever thing is not addition. The easy thing is addition. So if I have two sticks and they have regular markings on them, and like particularly I have a 0 and then regular, right? I can add numbers like 3 and 5, but I take a stick and I start at 0 and I march down to 3, right? And I take my second stick and I align the 0 of my second stick with the 3 on the first stick, right? And then I look out 5 more. And then I draw the line from the 0 of the first stick to the 5 of the second stick, and the answer is 8. Right? So if I take these two things, right, and slide them, I can do addition. Okay, so that's easy mechanically. How about multiplication? Oh crap, that seems like a lot harder. Okay, that's what logarithms are for, and that's what a slide rule is about. So a slide rule is about a homomorphism. It's a homomorphism between addition and multiplication. Okay? So if you take the logarithm of a product, you get a sum. You know this, right? The log of A times B is log A plus log B. Oh, that's interesting. What's the log of 1? It's 0. Oh, that's interesting. So we said log maps the associative operation of one monoid to the association of the other, associative operation of the other, and it maps the identity of one to the identity of the other. So we're saying, so log, like length, is a precise analogy. So length is a precise analogy between strings and natural numbers, and logarithms is between numbers considered multiplicatively and numbers considered additively. And what made them so darn useful is that by turning multiplication into addition, we already know how to compute addition mechanically by sliding things, right? And we had no way to do a multiplication quickly and accurately. Yeah, so this was a very important invention. Okay. Now let's consider something that kind of more interesting, computation. Okay. All right. So the idea is just take this analogy, and we're going to say my simple story. That's the one. That's a specification. That's the one I give the user. That's going to be one example of a monoid, a ring, or whatever. It's going to be one example of something that speaks a language. My implementation is going to speak the same language. Okay? You can't have a homomorphism unless you speak the same language. Okay. So what I mean by what you mean by this operation is what I mean by this. It translates by the homomorphism to what I mean. Yeah, faithfully, every operation. Yeah. Okay. So with programming, it's exactly the same thing. So denotational design is this very simple idea that I found enormously effective, which is you tell a very simple story that has nothing to do with the implementation. Okay. It's the story about what I want, what functionality I want that I'm willing to build an implementation out of. And I'm interested in it, even if I wasn't interested in computers. I'm interested in it in itself. Computers are a means to an end. Okay. So I want to describe that world. Okay. And let's say it's adding numbers, adding natural numbers, even something really simple. Okay. And now I have, but I want to like implement it. I want to help you to add numbers and do it dependably and do it quickly. Right? So dependable and efficient. Those are our values. Right? So I'm going to use this machine that seems to be good at stuff like that. Oops, here's a problem. The machine doesn't deal with numbers. It only deals with bits. Even that's not true. It only deals with voltages. Right? Right? So what the heck? I guess I can't use a machine to compute numbers. No, I can by making an analogy. Okay? And the analogy is there's some way in which I'm going to interpret these bit patterns as if they were numbers. Okay, that's like interpreting a string as its length, or interpreting a kind of multiplicative operation as an additive operation. Okay, so there's going to be this interpretation. So I want to describe something computational, and I want to give an interpretation for it, or I would use the word, and I use the word denotation. I want to give a denotation for it. I want to map that implementation into this other much simpler world, a world that has nothing to do with computers. Okay? And I'm going to make them speak the same language, because what I'm really going to give you is a piece of software or hardware. And what you're really going to do with it is tickle it with bits, not numbers. Okay? So you have numbers in your head. You're going to translate them to bits somehow. Someone's going to do that for you, some other piece of software, right, that somebody had to write. And when they had to write that, they had to really think about how you relate bits to numbers. How you relate bits and numbers to each other, yeah? So I'm going to give you this thing that only messes with bits, because it's a computer. It's this fiction we call digital computation. I'm going to give you one of those, okay? But you've got numbers, so what do? Well, you have to encode them into bits, okay? What bit pattern should you encode your inputs into? The answer is any bit pattern that denotes the number you have in mind, okay? Now, I could have said the binary encoding of your natural number, but it's a funny kind of accident of binary numbers that they uniquely represent, and in fact, it's not true. They don't uniquely represent, because of zeros and things. Okay, so you have to come up with a binary representation, a sequence of bits, such that if you apply the denotation function to that sequence of bits, the interpretation, it maps to the number you had in mind. Okay, it's a bit of a backward sounding story, but that's actually what the truth it is. I could say you convert your number into binary representation, but what I mean is you come up with a binary representation whose interpretation is the number you have in mind. Okay, now what do you do? Then what do you do? That's step one. There's a 3-step process. Okay, in your mind, there's a 1-step process. I'm going to go from a number to another number. Okay. That's the thing. I want to take the sign of this number, get this other, or I want to square it. Let's say it's a natural number. I'm going to square it, get this other number. That's a 1-step process. What I'm saying is when you use computers, you have to instead go through a 3-step process. Okay, and that 3-step process is, and those 4 pieces form the analogy. So instead of going from a number directly to the number that is at square, you have to do this instead. Go to a number, that's the input, convert it to binary. Okay, what it means to do it right is that if you interpret that binary, you get the number. Okay. Now we're going to stick the binary number through the implementation. That's what the implementation wants. It wants bit patterns, and you've given it one. Okay. Now you get a bit pattern out. I want a number out. What do? I interpret it, right, through this well-defined interpretation function that turns bits into numbers. When it turns into numbers, I don't mean it's a machine that does that. I mean there's a mathematical definition. This is what I mean by the bit pattern. Okay. Now what does it mean that my implementation is correct? Okay. Oh, I won't make gestures because our listeners will see that.
Yeah.
Okay. So imagine in your mind, dear listener, a rectangle. The top edge of the rectangle is your squaring function. It goes from numbers to numbers, and it does squaring. Okay. That's what you care about. The other 3 legs, okay, are the 2 verticals are going upward, and they map from bit vectors into numbers. Okay. And the 3rd at the bottom is the implementation. So the one at the top is the one you think about. The edge at the bottom is the implementation. The 2 vertical edges, yes, in bits. And the 2 vertical ones are saying, what does it mean that what does this bit computation have to do with a number computation? And it's saying exactly, well, you interpret the input, you interpret the output. Okay, and then and if you feed, so what you do is you start with a bit pattern of input. This is what it means to be correct. For every bit pattern that you might input, if I interpret it as a number and square that number, that's one path. Another path is I take that bit representation, put it through the implementation. I'm going to get a bit pattern or bit representation. And if I interpret that as a number, okay, do I get the same result or do I get different results? To be correct means you get the same result. That's what correct means. Okay, this is the idea of denotational design. Okay, so is that we have the specification, and it's in a domain that's nothing to do with computation. We have, I don't mean it doesn't have to be computable or something like that. I mean, it's not about machines. We have another thing, the implementation, which is all about machines. It's motivated by the problem you actually are interested in. And then we have the specifics about what do the 2 have to do with each other. That's the interpretation. Okay. Now that's one notion of what it means to be correct. Now, denotational design is a little more specific than that. And it's the following. It says there's a particularly beautiful, elegant, way to formulate these implementations and specifications and correctness proofs. Okay. Oh, yeah. So correctness means I want those 2 paths to be always produce the same results. A proof is a proof that is in fact the case. So for all inputs, if you interpret the input and then apply the mathematical function, it's the same as if you apply the implementation and then interpret the result. Okay. category theory, that's called the commutative diagram. That's all it is. It's like the most natural notion of correctness. If you didn't know about categories, try to figure out something precise, hopefully you'd come up with that one. Yeah. Okay. So denotational design takes this idea a little further. It's to say, now, let's suppose these two worlds, the specification on the top and the implementation on the bottom, I want to be able to talk about things in those worlds. So I'm going to need a language. Now, I don't mean a programming language, and I don't mean syntax. I mean a vocabulary. Okay, so talk about those things. Where am I going to get my vocabulary? I'm going to get them from abstract algebra, not from programming. Okay, so I want to know that. So my ideal situation is this. It turns out that in the world of specifications, the natural one, I didn't have to make it be this way. It's naturally a monoid. The things that you're talking about, they're natural numbers. They form a monoid. They do. Okay. And I want to use the same language, in other words, the same algebraic abstraction, monoid, to talk about the specification, the implementation. Okay, so I want them both to say, here's a monoid, but I want more than that. I want it to be a homomorphism. I want the interpretation of the implementation. When I say this is what the implementation means, this is what the data types mean, I want it to be homomorphic, because homomorphism means a precise analogy. Because when I design, it's not so much about applications. If you build applications are quite rigid. They have a user interface, but it's usually pretty ad hoc and so on. You don't expect it to be systematic. But if you're building something of like really composable, powerful functionality, something that's infinitely expressive, languages and libraries, okay, then we need essentially a language to talk about what are all the different things in the implementation. That's your API. That's what we call an API in programming, right? What are all the different things in the theory? Okay, so that is also a vocabulary. Now, what I'm saying is use the same vocabulary for them and interpret the representation, the data representations homomorphically. Okay, because what that means is it because it satisfies this goal of I want to give you a simple, true story that helps you and never hurts you. Okay, as my user. Okay, so what I'm saying is I'm going to build an implementation, and the API I'm going to give you is actually the monoid API. That'll often not be enough. Okay, then I'll make it richer. Maybe it's a group. Maybe it is a ring. I've got addition and multiplication, distributive property. Maybe it is a what's called a semi-modular, modular vector space, a higher dimensional kind of thing, like linear algebra for machine learning. Okay, these things have vocabularies. They have mathematical properties. Okay, so if I'm going to do like a linear algebra library, I know linear algebra is an algebraic abstraction. Linear algebra is all about a notion of vector spaces. These higher dimensional things could be vector spaces, could be a little bit less, like what's called a module or semi-module. Okay, and that has nothing to do with computation. It has nothing to do with matrices, and it has nothing to do with uniform n-tuples. These things that people call vectors, matrices. It is about abstract mathematical quantities. Okay, now I'm going to build an implementation. That's going to be different. That's going to have bits, and it's going to have things that I think of as being matrices and uniform n-tuples, arrays, that kind of thing, higher dimensional and lower dimensional arrays. Okay. But that's not the thing of interest. That's the thing with which I want to form a precise analogy. Okay. So linear algebra wants to speak a certain language, and that is that's the language of vector spaces. So you have vector. You have two types: scalars and vectors. So linear algebra is about vector spaces over a particular ring. Okay. So the scalars have to form what's called a ring. Sometimes you can just sometimes you want more, and you want it to be a commutative ring. Sometimes you want more than that. You want it to be a field. Field means you have division. Right. Okay. So, but you don't need that much. So it could just be a ring. So that's the scalars. Now, what are the vectors? Well, vectors are, there's the kind of things we're not going to say what they are, because there's actually a lot of different kind of things they can be. That's the point of abstract algebra. So of their operations. Okay. One operation is I can add two vectors. Okay. And another is that I can multiply a scalar by a vector. Now, so that's part of it. But the kind of the meat of linear algebra is not about the vectors; it's about the linear transformations. So linear algebra is about linear functions between vector spaces. Okay. So what does linear mean? It means it's a homomorphism. Okay. So vector spaces speak a language. The word linear means homomorphic for the language of vector spaces. Homomorphic means literally the Greek words means preserved structure, same homomorphism, shape, same shape. Okay, so homomorphism is an operation you can apply, like length to a string. That if the input is one of these, is the binary combination, the associative operator, right? Then so will the output be? It'll be a binary combination. If the input is the identity, the output will be the identity. With vector spaces, it's like that. If you apply to a scaling of a vector, you get a scaling of a vector out. So if you apply it s times u, you apply a linear function s times u, you get s times f of u. So f of s times u equals s times f of u. That's one. The other property is f of u plus v equals f of u plus f of v. Okay. So another way to say that is that linear transformations are precise analogies between two vector spaces, because everything you say in one maps to something you say with exactly the same language in the other. Okay, this is what we do. This is the only thing we do in software and hardware engineering. Is we make a novel thing, right? That's going to be this library that is running on a computer. Okay. Now, whoever wanted one of those? We only want those in order to solve other problems. We never want those for themselves. They are because I want to do linear algebra. Okay, that has nothing to do with computers. Okay, but I'm going to build something, and I want to talk in the same language I talk about linear maps. Okay, linear transformations, linear functions, they all mean the same thing. Okay, because that's a much simpler domain. I'll give you an example of how reasoning is incredibly more simple in the denotational model than it is in the operational model. So I'm calling here linear functions is the denotational model, matrices is the operational model. Okay, matrix is just a representation of linear maps. That's what they're for. That's the only thing they're for. Okay, but to make an analogy, we have to say, how do you interpret, just like I interpret a bit pattern as a number, how do you interpret a matrix as a linear transformation? That's the key question. If you're going to use matrices, the important question is, in what sense does a matrix represent a linear transformation? You have to be really clear about that. Okay, and you can do that if you think about what matrix vector multiplication. You multiply a matrix by a vector. Okay, we're saying you take a matrix and you got a vector and you get a vector out, right? Okay. Another way to say that is you take a matrix. This, if anybody who knows about currying will recognize this. Instead of taking a matrix and a vector and you get a vector, let's say you take a matrix and what you get out is a function from vectors to vectors. It's the same thing. All I did was curry my earlier explanation. Instead of saying it takes two arguments and gives a vector, I'm saying it takes one argument and gives a function from vectors to vectors. But it's a one-to-one notion. But the reason I did that is next we say, what kind of function? What are those functions like? Guess what? They're all linear. Right, when you apply a matrix to a vector and you get a new vector, that's the output depends linearly. It is a linear function of the input vector, and that linear function is describable by the matrix, and that is the one and only point of having the matrix in the first place, is to encode that linear map. Okay, that is why we have matrices. Now, why does this matter? Why would we bother making a distinction? That's the same thing. I work with graphic people for years and years and years, and they just identify the two. Transformation of matrices, they mean the same thing. But to me, it was always super important to clarify the distinction. Okay, and there are two, at least, kinds of reasons why it's so darned important to make this distinction. And I mean pragmatically. I don't mean philosophically or aesthetically or something. I mean pragmatically. Okay, so one reason is this, that there are things that are true about linear transformations. Well, there are things that are true about linear transformations and matrices, okay, that are much easier to prove on linear transformations than on matrices. So if you care about truth, you have to care about proof, because it's the only reliable road. Otherwise, you just get in the neighborhood, and the more complex it is, the further away from truth you are. Right? It's just unavoidable, unless you're just the luckiest person. Okay. So an example of this is matrix multiplication is associative. Okay. So matrix multiplication is associative. Okay, what the heck is matrix multiplication? Oh God, let's see, I learned this in class. There's a bunch of there's some columns and some rows, and I kind of remember you take some rows and some columns and you match them up, and then what do you do when you get two of these? You multiply some corresponding elements, and then you got a bunch of numbers, and you add them all up. Okay, so that's something to do with that, right? Now that is what it is. And it's quite complex. You got to get it just right, and it's easier to get wrong than right. Okay. Now, prove that's associative. Okay, so I define matrix multiplication in a pretty complex way. I'm not saying it's more complex than what people are learning. It's exactly what people are learning. Now there's a really, really important property of matrix multiplication, which is associative. That's an extremely important property. It's important in programming because we care about performance, and matrix multiplication is associative only denotationally, not operationally. Okay, right? So in other words, the meaning of a matrix, what do I mean by that? If you have three matrices and they're in the right shapes to be multiplied by each other, is A times B times C. Should I multiply? So associativity says you can multiply A by C, A by B, and then by C, or you can multiply B by C and then pre-multiply by A. They give you the same answer. That's true. Same answer. In other words, denotational. Right? Operationally, no, they're incredibly different. The operations you perform are very, very different in those two cases. Should I care? If you care about efficiency, you better darn well. Because matrix multiplication is very non-associative operationally, and it is exactly associative denotationally. Okay, so that's why it matters. Okay, so now hopefully I've motivated. You should go ahead and prove that matrix multiplication is associative. Okay, you can always say I already proved it, or it's in a book, or whatever. All right, well, somebody had to do this work, and if you don't know how to do that work, then you can't do it on your problem. That is kind of like it, but not quite, right? You need to know how to do these things if you want reliable software. Okay, so if the problem is prove it multiplication is associative, right? This is a very, very hard proof, which is you just go through and you use the definitions, right? You do it in code, it's going to be terrible, especially if it's imperative code, right? Like for loops and stuff, like, oh my God, right? Or if you use summation notation, right? It's still complicated, all right? So what I'm suggesting is this is a very hard proof. It's a very costly proof. I don't mean nobody's done it. Of course, people have done it over and over and over, and they've all suffered. Now I want to give you an extremely simple proof, okay? Which is this. Matrix multiplication. So matrices denote linear functions. Matrix multiplication denotes function composition. Function composition is associative. Therefore, matrix multiplication is associative. Yeah. It's because the reason that matrix multiplication is associative is because of what it means, not because of how it works. Okay. All right. That was a subjective statement. Let me try to say that more objectively. You can try to answer the question of matrix associative with matrix multiplication operationally or denotationally. If you look at it operationally, then you're going to have to think about how it works. Okay. And then the proof that you get the same answer is extremely complex. And it's not even in the realm of how things works, right? You do two very different computations. Somehow you get the same answer, all right? You have to go through all that. If instead you say, no, the purpose of a matrix is to denote a linear transformation. And I'm going to be entirely clear about how that is, the mapping from a matrix to a linear function. That's the same mapping we were just talking about that goes from a bit pattern to a natural number, all right? Or for logarithms, from a multiplicative kind of number to an additive kind of number. It's exactly the same operation. It's the vertical arrows in that rectangle. Okay, so the very first thing you would do if you were interested in computing with linear algebra is you'd say, okay, I get linear algebra. I know what it is. It's about functions that are linear. Nothing to do with matrices. You may have been taught otherwise, but I'm sorry that was a disservice to you to think that linear algebra is about matrices. Okay, it's about functions that are linear. Okay, so now we say, I want to implement on a computer. Oh, well, geez, I'm going to have to decide how to implement these functions. There are a bunch of choices. One of them is to implement them as what we call functions, and particularly in functional programming, not what apparent people call functions, because those aren't functions; those are procedures. But genuinely functional, purely functional, people call functions. Yeah. So you could do that. That's fine. It's easy, and it's easy to do a correct linear algebra library. However, it's going to be very inefficient for a lot of useful purposes. Okay. Matrices are often, but not always, a much more efficient representation, okay, of functions that are linear. Okay, I can give you examples, but I don't think it's worth going there unless you really want to know. All right, so we need to know, how does a matrix represent? How does it denote a linear function? Okay, we get that right. Okay, now we no longer have to say, okay. One funny thing about matrix multiplication, not only do you have to prove it's associative, which is hard, right? You have to prove the identity also about it. That's hard. You even have to come up with it in the first place, right? Come up with matrix multiplication. How on earth would you come up with it, right? There is a completely systematic way to do that with denotational design, okay? And every denotational design works in the same way. You say, I know what my denotation is, linear functions. Okay, my mathematical model, simple mathematical model. I'm going to choose a representation. I don't want to say I know what it is. I'm going to say I'm going to choose one. Okay, maybe I'm going to choose matrices just because everybody else is choosing it, or maybe I have a good reason. Okay, often people choose it wrongly, and that's really harmful. Okay, but let's say that's the right. It's a choice you want to make. I'm going to use matrices. So I got to be clear about what it means. Okay. Now, how should matrix multiplication work? Okay. Do you just get to write anything down you want? It's as good as anything else. Everybody's entitled to their own opinion these days. Okay. What are the criteria for success of matrix multiplication? Does your program have to be a legitimate? Does it have to parse? Is that your bar? Does it have to type check? Is that your bar? If it has to type check, what language are you talking about? Are you talking about some really weakly typed language? Are you talking about pretty darn strongly typed language? Is it going to be like Haskell? That's got pretty strong types. Is it going to be Agda? That's got much, much stronger types. Right? So what are your criteria? Okay. With Agda, you have a chance of actually getting an adequate criteria, but not unless you really try. You could still give an inadequate one. Okay, so type checking just means the most egregious, boneheaded answers you might give are rejected automatically. That's what type checking is about. Okay, in other words, things that are superficially obviously wrong. That's what type checking is for. That's what parsing and type checking are to eliminate those. Okay, what about all the others? Most of them are wrong for matrix multiplication. Okay, so type checking isn't enough. What is enough? Okay,
how about
now
testing?
We could give. Okay, how about testing? All right, so how do you know when you've tested enough?
That's the question.
Yeah, testing cannot get to truth. Testing can only detect errors, and worse than that, it can only detect the obvious errors. And obvious errors are our friends, not our enemies. Right? Right? It's just like pain, right? Pain in the human body serves a constructive purpose. It tells us that there's something that needs our attention. If you get rid of the pain, you lose that message. Obvious bugs are exactly the same thing. Obvious bugs are there to say there's a problem. Do we want to silence that information, or do we want to really explore it and learn everything we can? So I want to learn everything I can. Okay, so testing chases away the most obvious bugs and leaves the more subtle ones behind. Okay, and also in theory, of course, in most cases you can't test enough to get to truth. Yeah, so testing can't be the answer. So what can be the answer? What makes your matrix multiplication correct and mine not correct? Mine that's completely goofy. Okay, so denotational design gives an answer, and it's always the same question, and it's always the same answer, and it's this: matrix multiplication must form a perfect analogy to function composition. Okay, so linear maps speak a language, and matrices speak the same language. Okay, we know what composition means for linear maps. Okay, that's what matrix multiplication should mean. Okay? So matrix multiplication, we have to say, what does it have to do with? So we know what the input and output. The input to matrix multiplication is matrix, two matrices, and output is another matrix. Okay, but those matrices have meanings. They're linear maps. So is there a function on linear maps that is a perfect analogy? Really say it the other way around. Is matrix multiplication a perfect analogy to some simpler notion of linear maps? And the answer is yes, composition. Composition is the one and only motivation for matrix multiplication. Well, I don't know, maybe there's some other uses, but in linear algebra, that's why we have matrix multiplication. Okay, so now what does it mean for matrix multiplication to be correct? It means the analogy holds. It means that if you take two matrices, remember that's like the bit representations, that's the machine representations, the low level. If you take these two and you apply this operation, we call it matrix multiplication, but we shouldn't. We should call it matrix composition. Multiplication is a misleading word, right? Because the analogy isn't to multiplication, it's to composition. So that's what we should call it, multiplication. Matrix addition is analogous to linear map addition. Good job. Matrix multiplication is analogous to linear map composition. Oops, bad naming job. We should have called it matrix composition instead. Okay. So now the theorem is just this. If you take two matrices and you put it into this function and you get a matrix out and you interpret it as a linear map, you get exactly the same result as if you take those two matrices and interpret it as linear maps and you compose them. Okay. That's the commutative square. That's exactly what it means to be correct. Okay. Now, if that's your definition of correctness, if you have implemented matrix multiplication correctly, by that definition, it cannot help but be associative. You can prove that without even knowing the definition of matrix multiplication, only knowing that it's correct. Okay. Now there's an important hitch, which is you have to say what you mean by equality.
Right.
Right.
That's a hard problem, and
yeah. Well, but it is a hard problem. But there's always a lovely answer in denotational thinking, right? Okay. So, well, it depends. So equality is important. Okay. And it's part of our vocabulary. Even if we don't implement it, it's part of our vocabulary, right? To say like, this matrix multiplied by that is equal to that. We have to say what we mean by equal. Okay. So equality is also part of the language of linear functions. Okay? We know what it means for linear functions to be equal. So look, they're talking the same language, the language of equality. Do they talk it consistently? In other words, in perfect analogy, or don't they? Okay, so the analogy for equality is simpler than matrix multiplication. It's saying if you have two matrices, then they are equal if and only if their meanings are equal. Okay, so you have these two matrices, and you put them through a unary. You put them through. Yeah, you put the two matrices through equality. And I want to know if I put them through the thing I'm calling equality. Okay, I shouldn't say it is equality. It's an operation for which I want to use the word equality. I mean, I should only use that word if it fulfills the perfect analogy. Otherwise, I'm giving you a gun to shoot your foot with. Okay, so two matrices should be equal if and only if their meanings are equal. Okay, this isn't true about just matrices. It's true of everything you do in programming. Okay, what the notion of equality on your representations, for it to be in a sensible universe, has to be homomorphically faithful. In other words, things are equal exactly when their meanings are equal. Okay. Otherwise, I'm telling you, these representations mean the same thing, but they're not equal, right? So in other words, you should think of them as these things that are equal, and yet they are unequal in a way that you can detect. Okay. That's an example of how I break an analogy and set you up to hurt yourself. I'm saying think of them as linear maps, and then I'm giving you an operation that is inconsistent with that story. Okay. So if you define matrix multiplication, if not even defined, if you specify it as saying it has one job, which is to fulfill its part in this homomorphism, it has to be the analog of composition. Okay, that's its only job. So I come up with a definition, and I prove that in fact the homomorphism applies, and I have to use this bit about equality. If you use that definition of equality, which is always the right thing to do in engineering, then laws like associativity will always follow. You never need to prove them; they always follow from the homomorphic denotational discipline. It's examples in my paper: type class morphisms, denotational design, class morphism, like that. That I illustrate, why that's the case. You don't need to prove things. If you ever need to prove an algebraic property, it's a symptom that you are picking away at the surface, right? And if you prove those properties, okay, you just know that the properties hold, but you still don't know it means what you want. If you prove it means what you want, you don't have to prove the properties. They always follow from the discipline. Okay, so I just give you an example. So the denotational design is just this. You say, I want to build something. What does it mean? It means I'm doing linear algebra. What's linear algebra about? It's about linear maps. Isn't it about matrices? No, it's about linear maps. Okay. So then I would say, okay, what representation you want to use? Okay, let's try the first one. Let's do a bunch. One of them will be matrices. Okay. So to say what it means for that to be a representation, to say precisely what it means, is I have to say in what way it denotes, or how do I map from the representation the meaning. What's the mathematical operation? That operation, by the way, doesn't even have to be computable. We're never going to compute with them. We're only going to compute with representations. We're only going to think with meanings. It's these consistency properties, the homomorphisms, that guarantee that the way we think and the way that the thing actually runs are consistent, that the difference between them, because of course they're different, but the difference is undetectable through this vocabulary. That's what it means. In other words, we've given somebody a language in which they can think about a simple thing and yet get it to run on top of physics efficiently. Even though, or if you want to think about running on our machine, and our machine is bit patterned, which it isn't really, but if we pretend that, I'm going to give you this bit pattern manipulator that actually implements, linear map composition correctly. But of course, you have to be clear about what you mean by how do the matrices relate to the linear maps. Okay, so that's the denotational design story. You think, what do I want to talk about, not with? Okay, So I think in the first, probably our conversation, I shared a Dijkstra's comment about computer science is no more about computers than astronomy is about telescopes. Okay. All right. So linear algebra is not about computers. Right? We use computers. A computer is a telescope with which to look at linear algebra. That's what it's for. Okay. But it's a pretty darn clever tool that you can look at a whole lot of different things with. But every one of those things is a different analogy. And if you're not clear about what the analogy is, you can't even be clear about how to ask the question of whether your implementation is correct. Because, of course, my matrix program does not implement linear algebra because linear algebra is about linear functions and my matrices are something else. Of course, my CPU can't do multiplication on numbers or addition on numbers because it manipulates bits, not numbers, right? So that's why you have to be totally clear about the interpretation of the representations into this mathematical world. Once you do that, and then if you use this homomorphic discipline, okay, then all the properties necessarily hold. And you know so much more than just proving that the properties hold. You know exactly what it means. Right? I don't want to just prove this thing's a vector, that something is a vector space, or I don't want to just prove that. I want to prove it means a particular vector space, linear functions. Right? I'm sorry, that wasn't a good example. I don't want something to just manipulate bit patterns. I want it to mean a particular manipulation of bit patterns. So I got to be really clear about these relationships. Now that sounds a little heady, and it's not the way software engineers are trained, but it's incredibly simple in Gell-Mann's sense. You can make this notion of correctness of the question, of both the question and the answer. Okay, but the most important is the question. You can make the question precise and very concisely in terms of mathematics that we have learned for a variety of other reasons, and not esoteric mathematics. I rarely use esoteric mathematics. I use category theory, which people think is esoteric, but I'm a category theory newbie. I use very, very simple category theory. Yeah. It's just because there are some patterns I want that are captured there that are not captured by monoids and rings and stuff.
Right. Need more abstraction. But yeah, I like that. It's as if the notational design is bridging the gap of our implementation details, right? Because there is some hairy stuff that the computer has to get away with, because that's how the computer works, right? That's the real world is the implementation detail.
Or maybe because there's a really simple implementation that's terribly inefficient, and I have a super clever, complicated one that's very efficient. I want to make darn sure that it gives the same answer.
Right. So then you're providing this translation, let's put that way, so that we can actually think about it. Think about it in the terms that we can, that we know how to think about it properly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So the denotational model and the implementation are optimized for in opposite directions. Okay. So we need specifications and we need implementations, and they both have values, or they both have forces attached to them, and they're pulling in opposite directions. Okay. So the specification is pulled toward precise simplicity. The implementation is pulled toward efficiency. Okay. And those are not always, but often enough to be important, opposite directions. Okay. Like, for instance, if all you want is linear maps, don't use matrices, use functions. It's so much simpler. You can't get it wrong. Matrices there's all kinds of ways to get matrices wrong. I work with graphics people. It seemed like half of them like to multiply the matrix, the vector matrix, half of them like to put it on the left, half of them put it on the right. And then the worst thing, right, is that they shared code, and that code was, and those matrices are square often, 3x3 or 4x4, which means if you get the order wrong, it'll still, like, nobody's going to catch you. The type checker won't catch you. The runtime won't catch you. You'll just get a wrong answer. All right. So that's the people I work with. And half the community, and they do these opposite conventions, right? And they work together. So it's disastrous. But that problem goes away as soon as you introduce denotation. You say, this is my interpretation. I have matrix and interpretation. You have matrix interpretation. The terrible situation there was they had the same representation with different meanings. Okay. And nothing automated was going to catch that inconsistency, right? Which means they were allowed to put things together and have them not work right. Yeah. So if instead I have a matrix, but I have an interpretation of my matrix. You have a matrix and interpretation. As soon as we try to put those together and prove correctness, we're going to have to reconcile interpretations. It's going to fall down, right? Because the theorems depend on having the same interpretation. Yeah. So that error is going to get caught by the type checker if you use a modern dependently typed language and you use denotational design as your discipline.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So here's I think a fundamental point. Excuse me for interrupting you. Is that specifications and implementations are important, and they're pulled in opposite directions quite often. Specifications should be as simple as possible and free of any kind of detail that's about implementation, operationality, or clever tricks, limitations of the machine or my machine model or whatever. Implementations should be full of that stuff and take advantage of it. Right? Implementation should be optimized for the particular weird thing you're running on. Right? Like if it's a GPU, then for goodness sake, optimize on it for a GPU. If it's FPGA, do it for that. Right? Okay. So these are opposite directions they're pulled in. Okay. Now I think inevitably, if we want good quality results, we have to allow them to be pulled apart. In other words, we have to allow specifications and implementation-like things to be different. Operational semantics puts them together. That to me is the fundamental flaw. Okay. So in operational semantics, it says, and like Dan pointed this out, Dan Geeka said, what is it? Denotational semantics let you write things that are like not even computational. Like what the heck, right? Well, first of all, that's not really true. The domains do include computability. That's why they're continuous CPOs and information, that kind of stuff. But aside from that, it doesn't matter. Operational semantics may, by its form, makes computation more explicit than denotational. Okay. So in that way, it kind of assures it. Denotational, maybe you agree, maybe you don't agree that it assures it. It's fine. But even if it were the case that denotational doesn't ensure that it's computable, operational doesn't do a good enough job of it. Okay. So operational semantics may show you that indeed it's computable, but I don't want it. I don't want something computable. I want a good implementation. I don't want something that can be implemented. I want something that is implemented well. Okay. So how do you get there? Existence of an operational semantics doesn't help. And in fact, it often hinders because it moves you down an operational road that's away from performance. For instance, maybe you have a fairly sequential operational semantics. Well, no efficient implementation is sequential in the modern era, right? Like performance comes from parallelism in the era we live in, and increasingly so. Okay, so if your operational semantics is pointing you down a sequential road, you have to undo that work to get back to something more denotational, and then you can go forward. So it's harder, not easier. Okay, so with denotational, okay, it does both a worse and better job as far as like computation, as far as like implementation. It does a worse job, and then it doesn't try to do it at all. It doesn't try at all to like show you a recipe for computing. It does a better job, kind of in the same way, by not misleading you that it's giving you any useful notion at all of how you get an efficient implementation. So and denotational design exactly ties them together. Denotational design says you have a denotation. It's not about computation. It's about what it is. Right? It's the stars. It's not the telescope. It's the thing I'm interested in, not the tool I'm using. Okay. Now I also have an implementation because I care because I want to run it on physics, on computers. Okay. Now I want those two to be consistent. I want them to be perfectly analogous. Okay. That's what a correctness proof is for. Okay. That's what a correctness theorem and proof is for. Now I want the theorem to be I want it to be simple because that makes it more valuable because it can't be proved. It's the one thing that can't be proved. So it has to be simple in order for it not to be misleading. Okay. So denotation does a better job of that by removing any kind of operationally motivated stuff. Okay. So it gives you better simplicity. And then it doesn't give you better implementation, operationality. It in a way helps you by not even promising it. It just says, by the way, you're going to need, if you want to run this thing, you're going to need the implementation also. And then I say, okay, well, first of all, what century do I live in? The 21st century. So it can't possibly be, if I care about efficiency, it can't possibly be sequential, right? Because sequential computers haven't existed for decades, even into the 70s, 80s, 90s, right? We only have machines that pretend to be sequential, that are parallel, that waste almost all their energy on that fiction. Okay, so if we want to do it now, we want it efficient, I should think about FPGA. I should think about it GPU. I should think about an ASIC. I should think about some other wild mesh of very simple processing elements, something like that. That is an efficient implementation. Okay. Now, what does that have to do with my specification? Well, there's a theorem, and that theorem is a homomorphism. And there's a proof, and that proof is machine checked. So what do I get is I have a specification that's incredibly simple to reason about and understand formally and informally. I want to know if the thing called composition is associative. Well, yeah, because it means, you know what it means. It means function composition is associative. Okay, so you can reason about it formally and informally. Okay, you also have an implementation that is a really good performance one, not a silly kind of nominally operational, but a very excellently operational implementation. You have the theorem that relates to and you have a proof. That's what denotational design. It doesn't encourage you to conflate two things that have antithetical forces applied to them, which is specification and implementation. Yeah, because if you conflate those two things, you cannot win, or one can only win at the other's loss.
How would the design? How does the language in that specification side look like here for you to be able to reason about it mathematically?
Oh God, yeah, it's incredibly simple. So first of all, you have to have some way to talk about algebraic abstractions that gives you the common language. Now you don't literally have to do that, but it's prettier if you do. Okay, so like Haskell has this thing called type classes. Agda has something that's similar in spirit. It's more flexible. Agda is a more modern language. You have to have some way to set up being able to talk in the same language so that you can even talk about an analogy. Like plus means plus, compose means compose. Okay, or you could do that in a less pretty way. You could just like have a module system, or you can use names that are similar or something like that. Okay, so we're gonna have our language and meanings, and it's gonna be mathematics. And remember, we're never gonna have to implement it. So three of those. Remember the rectangle. The top is the specification, the bottom's the implementation, the vertical sides are the interpretations of the inputs and outputs. Okay, we're only ever gonna. The idea is that a user only thinks about the top one, which is much simpler, right, than everything else. The implementation only ever does the bottom one. It doesn't do the sides or the top. The correctness is what ties them together. Yeah, okay, so what I do first is I say, well, what do I want to talk about? I want to do linear algebra. Okay, what is the language of linear algebra? Not matrices, linear algebra. Okay, so I got to think about it. What is that? Oh yeah, there's vector spaces or modules or semi-modules, and there's linear functions on them. That's what linear algebra is about. Okay, so what's the language? Well, for the operations, we're going to have addition of linear functions, which means pointwise addition. F plus g is the function. You give it x, and it gives you f of x plus g of x. That's pointwise addition. Okay, so that's something that's done very commonly with these linear functions, and we can compose them. And when we compose them, this is interesting. When you compose functions, the output type of one has to match the input type of the other, right? When you multiply matrices, the width of one has to be equal to the height of the other. Why? Because of the first thing I said, okay? Because they denote linear maps, and the heights and widths are the types of the domain and codomain of those linear maps. So to say that the height of one equals the width of the other translates homomorphically into saying the output type of one is equal to the input type of the other, and therefore you can compose them. That's why matrix multiplication has that. It's not for any other reason but that. Yeah. Okay. And if you know that, you can't get it wrong. Even if the two things have like a square, you can't compose them in the wrong order without just saying like just being right in front of you. All right. So what you do is you ask what vocabulary. Okay. I'm going to have addition. I'm going to have zero. I'm going to have identity. I'm going to have addition and multiplication. I'm going to have composition. Okay, there are a few other things. I might want to have first and left projection of a pair. That's linear. So think about what are some linear operations. If I have a pair and I project out the first element, that's linear. Second element, that's linear. Okay. If I have a value and I want to append a zero to the right or left, make a pair, zero right or left, that's also linear. Okay, so I'm going to throw in those operations. Now I'm going to say, okay, do those operations live in some kind of algebra? Is there some kind of algebra already out there that has those operations? Remember, we're not talking about matrices. Okay, I'll look around and think, well, I mean, yeah, there's this vector space thing, but there's also categories. Categories are what gives you identity and composition. Okay, I don't want to scare. I wish people weren't scared of categories. When I say categories, just think monoid, group, category. Just another one of those. It's simpler than the others. A category is just a monoid with types. Okay, you have an associative operation. Instead of calling it multiplication, you call it composition. Instead of saying you could take any of those two things and combine them, and say no, only if the output type of one matches the input type of the other. That's all it is. Okay, and the identity is typed also. You don't just have one identity; you have one for every type. Identity of that maps this type to itself. For matrices, you have this. That's why identity is square, because it maps from a type to itself. That's why the width and height are equal. Okay, so in denotational design, you say, for most important thing is, what do I want to talk about? Okay, I want to talk about these linear maps. Okay, and then the second question is, what is a language? What's a vocabulary in which I can express these things? I can build them up, right? Combine them, build them out of nothing, all these things. Okay, great. It's these operations. What algebraic abstraction already exists, and we've already proven things. We've already learned it for some other reason, like Mary Coleman said. Okay, all right. Well, it's actually something called the particular kind of category. Byproduct categories is one way to think about it, or you can just think about the linearity stuff. It's fine. Okay. Then the next step is now we're going to say, okay, so that now I kind of understand the mathematical realm, the specification. That's the story I'm going to tell the user. That's exactly the story I'm going to tell the user. Nothing else. Okay. Now what about the implementer? What I'm going to tell the implementer, which may be me. Okay. It might be somebody else. Okay. What I'm going to tell them is, I want you to find a way of implementing the first story. Okay. And there are two kinds of choices to make. One is the representation you're going to use for the things of interest, linear transformations. Okay. And the other is how you're going to implement the operations. Which operations? The one that the first model already wants to talk about. So you take the language that the math wants to talk about and you make that your API. That's what you do need to do. You make that the API. Now, how do you know how to implement them correctly? Well, there's two questions. What does it mean to be correct? And then how do you get there? What it means to be correct is always the same. It's a homomorphism. Okay. So about the homomorphism, you have to talk about, well, what in what sense does you have to pick a representation and then say, how does it mean? How does it denote the other things? For matrices, pretty simple. That's what we call matrix vector multiplication, curried. Yeah, exactly. Once you define that, if you can't answer that question, how does the representation mean, the things we're talking about? You shouldn't try anything else. I mean, you shouldn't, if you don't know what the representations mean, you can't possibly address the question of how to implement operations on them, because it's only the meaning that guides them. You have to know what the arguments mean and what the operation means. And that's all you have to know. Because now you have an equation in one unknown. Okay. So every homomorphism equation in denotational design is an equation in one unknown. So you have the interpretations, and you have the operation in the semantics. And what I don't know is what's the operation on the representation. But I have a homomorphism equation, and that's the equation in one unknown. The unknown is usually function valued. What is matrix multiplication? Okay, so maybe people aren't always used to thinking that's an algebra equation with one unknown, but it totally is. And with a little bit of equational reasoning, sometimes easy, sometimes hard, you solve that algebra problem, and the answer to the algebra problem is a correct implementation. And if anything that's an implementation, anything you might want to call an implementation that is not a solution is wrong, right? Because it's not faithful to the meaning of the arguments in the operation. Everything that does is right.
So one thing that I'm trying to picture in my head is how to have the operational semantics solved in this realm. Because what operational semantics is doing, and correct me if I'm wrong, or if I'm not picturing the problem in the right lens, but it seems like you have this language that is computable, which means that you have a language that can run in a sense, and you want to show that it's type safe, right? So you have a way for it to run. Well, when you're doing operational semantics,
those are it's correct,
right? Well, yeah. Usually, one way to show that it's correct is through type safety, progress, and preservation, right? In operational semantics,
no. Yeah. So if you're talking about operational semantics, those are usually the things they go after.
Okay.
Yeah. But and so yeah, and it's a relatively complicated story.
Right. So how would you picture and deal with these problems in the notational design?
What is the question that you think needs to be dealt with?
Right. So that's what I was trying to picture in my mind, right? So I have a language. I'm trying to design a language, right? I have this language. So I'm thinking of my new cock, right? I'm trying to come up with a very small CIC, and I want to show that it's type safe. So I want to show that it has strong normalization, and if the types are properly tied together, then when I do a step and when I do these minute beta reductions, I'll get to something that is also type safe, that is also has this proper type, right?
Yeah. So that's something you've been trained to want.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, you've been conditioned to want that. And what I'm saying is that's not a natural thing to want.
Okay.
That it's a teachable thing. You can teach people how to do it, and you can get them addicted to it. In other words, you can get them to want it. But you've just described this kind of like there's this game. Somebody made up this game and then has got these rules, operational semantics, right? And you follow the rules, and here's how to do it successfully. And not every first year student can do it, but if you work really hard, you can learn the rules. And look, there are these conferences, and they're publishing things like that. That seems to say that it's worth doing, right? So that's a game you've been taught to play, and you've been conditioned to value, to think is important. Okay. So, but suppose operational semantics is not an end to itself; it's a means to an end. Which of course it is, right? Okay, then it can't be the goal. So what are we really trying to accomplish? Okay. Now, what we're trying to accomplish is what I've said a few times, which is we have some problems definable outside of technology, right? We have some puzzles that have nothing to do with technology, like something in linear algebra. And I want to use this machine, this kind of, part real, part fictitious notion of a digital computer to help me solve that problem. Okay, well, first of all, you got to be clear on what that means, right? So, talk about, right? Okay, so one way to kind of tackle that is to say, let's make up a language and let's give it a type system and let's give it a small or large step operational semantics. And then let's go about and do the standard mantra of ritual of these, strong normalization, type preservation, stuff like that, right? But none of that has anything to do with the problem I'm trying to solve. The problem I'm trying to solve is I know what the mathematical thing is. How can I get my computer, my machine, whatever my technology is, right, to implement something that is analogous to it? That has nothing to do with small step operational semantics, type preservation, any of that.
Wait, what is exactly the mathematical thing that I want to do? That's not clear to me.
Oh, okay. So if you're doing machine learning, right, you're going to want to do some linear algebra.
This higher purpose languages I don't have a different language for machine learning and a different language for, what we do here. Yeah.
Okay. Well, then I want to bring up another, I think, really important point.
Okay.
I don't know how not to bring it up at this point. Ask your question again. Sorry, it jumped out of my head while I was
right. So the question here is like, okay, in operational semantics, I'm coming up with a language, the higher purpose language that I can do pretty much anything, and I want to show that it's not going to crash randomly, right? There's some property there.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
Of the language itself, right? Yeah.
All right. So here's the point. We don't need languages. Let me say that differently. We don't need new languages. Okay. So there's something that this is like, it's a different point. It's tied up with operational semantics, but it's only loosely tied up. Okay. So I've been a computer professional for a very long time now. I have designed a few languages when I was young. Okay. I haven't in a very long time what I would call a programming language. Sometimes I use the word language. Okay. Like in these conversations, but I usually mean the language of semi-rings. 0, 1 plus times. That's the language I'm talking about. Okay. Or monoids. Right, or vector spaces or something. Okay, that's usually the language I mean. And I'm talking about algebra, not about programming. Okay. So if you want to solve a problem, do you want to create a new language for it? Okay. That habit is in vogue. Okay, people do that, and so operational semantics people do it. Denotational semantics people do it. Classical ones do it. I don't. Okay. So there's this really important thing that I hadn't said, and I could see that I think it created some confusion, and Dan's response I think mirrored something I didn't come around and say, which is really important, which is that I don't design languages, and I do use denotation. So what the heck, right? Isn't denotational semantics about giving meanings to languages? Okay, that is the original use, and that's not what I do. What I do is I design programming interfaces and implementations. Okay. Now, a language is a programming interface, right? And hopefully it has an implementation. All right. But most programming interfaces are not languages. They live in languages. They're used with languages. Okay. So long time ago, in the 60s, Peter Landon wrote a seminal paper that had an enormous influence. I suspect most programmers don't know Peter Landon, but they have been influenced by him incredibly. Peter Landon wrote a seminal paper called The Next 700 Programming Languages. I think it was published in 1966, I think. Okay. So you've probably heard of this paper. This is the paper that introduces the idea of what we now call domain-specific embedded languages. And he starts out by saying this: a programming language has two parts. Okay, it has a part that is about describing things, and a part that is about gluing things together to make new things. Okay, it's very simple. You look at a programming language, you'll see that there's really two languages in there. One is a language; it's a vocabulary, what I call a lexicon. Okay, it's a thing. It's like numbers and addition, right, and strings and stuff. Okay, that's one part of the language. The other part of the language is, you might call it the glue language, or I was going to say meta language, but it's only a meta language through Peter Landon's perspective. So I don't, never mind. Okay, so the rest of it is about like procedures and variables, and for imperative language is about sequencing. For functional language is about composition. Right, type systems. Right, that's a language kind of a thing. So Peter Landon in this paper, he said we're headed in a terrible direction. Every year there's more and more new languages. Right, the computation is exploding. We're like, we're going to have more than 5 computers in the world. It looks like, right? Computation is being very successful, right. and so people are applying it to more and more domains, and so they're making more and more languages because we've been tying languages to domains. Okay, and this paper is saying that is a terrible mistake. Okay, a very costly mistake. And what he says we should do instead, what he recommends, is that we pick one host language and we embed all vocabularies in it. In other words, you first have to recognize that programming languages of the time have these two components. One is, you might call a host language, which is domain independent, and then you have the domain-specific vocabulary. And that's what this paper is about, saying make that distinction and then stop reinventing the host language. Keep reinventing the domain-specific vocabularies. Okay. So nowadays, we call these programming languages and APIs, or libraries, that distinction. Okay, so this approach has a ton of pragmatic benefits, and I personally believe in it very strongly. It's almost always a mistake, and a very tangibly harmful mistake, to design a programming language. Okay, now so this story that you were talking about is I'm going to design this language, right? And I got to say, it's got this type system, and it's got this small step operational semantics and all this stuff. And what I'm saying is that's a mistake from the get-go. Okay. Occasionally, very occasionally, there's a reason to invent a new language. The discovery of dependent typing, hell yeah, that was a good reason to invent a new language. The discovery of types, period, was a good reason to do a new language. Discovery of computation, that's mechanizable, that's a good reason. Every so often, there's a good reason to invent a new language. Almost never. So the factor of how often we should invent a new vocabulary versus a new language is enormous. I don't even know. Nowadays, a million? Billion? Probably billion's too much, probably a million's too small. I'm not sure, right? But so my job, and I think almost everybody who listens to this podcast, unless you're an academic in current PLT, but that I think has lost its way, you're going to be designing APIs. That's what I do, okay? So when I design an API, I don't give it a type system. I don't give it a semantics at the level of, like, how does if work, right? What does function application mean? Is it lazy? I mean, is it strict? Is it non-strict? Call by value need. Is it sequential or functional? If I want one of those, I'm going to pick one. I'm not going to invent one and embed it into that. Yeah, exactly. Okay.
And then all you have to do is to show that the translation preserves the operations of your host language in this denotational design notion, right?
Well, so what I do is I don't design a language. And I'm maybe guilty of misleading people by not being like really clear about this. When I'm talking about denotational, I don't mean design of languages. I mean design of libraries. And moreover, I think there are very strong reasons that we've known it for decades of why you should invent libraries and not languages. Okay. And what I see over and over is somebody has some feature they want. Okay. Let's say automatic differentiation. Let's say differentiation. All right. some feature, and it's a little hard to a little hard to imagine how you could stick it into how you could add it to an existing language. Sometimes it's not hard. People are not educated to try hard enough, or they don't have, or they don't understand the spectrum of possibilities of what you actually can do with a good host language. Maybe they're using C or C# or JavaScript or some imperative something or other, Rust or something. Those languages are really bad at hosting other vocabularies. Functional languages are really good at it. Non-strict functional languages are particularly good at it. Dependently typed are also, even more so good at it. There are technical reasons for all of it. That's not just an opinion. There are strengths. Okay, so if somebody says, I have this new feature, I'm going to design a language to show it off. And right, how many currently published programming language theory papers are of that form? An awful lot. I have this feature. Here's my language. Here's an extended lambda calculus. Here's some kappa calculus. Here's some pi calculus, something or other, right? But it's extended. Okay, and so now I have to give a semantics to the whole darn language, almost none of which has to do with my feature. Okay, and I have to make a whole bunch of decisions, and every one of those could be disastrous. Okay, and so lots of decisions to make, lots of disastrous wrong choices to make, and almost none of them are relevant to the point I want to make. But it does fill up 20 pages, right? And it will get you published in this era. I hope not much longer, but it does right now. Okay, so the more fundamental point is don't design languages. Okay, so it's really two things: design libraries, not languages. Design them denotationally, not operationally. Operational semantics usually has them bound up. What's classically called denotational semantics also has it bound up, giving the style of semantics and in the context of designing a language. And what I'm saying is, first of all, separate those two and then decide you want operational or denotational for the library, not the language. Yeah, and so that's what I do. I design libraries and their denotation. So linear algebra, that's a library. Now there are some cases where it's kind of tricky. It's a little trickier to separate them, and one of them is automatic differentiation, because automatic differentiation is non-computable. So in a literal sense, if you make it a library and not a language, you're kind of hosed from the get-go. In other words, if in your programming language you make a function, then it's not possible to hand that off with just the semantics of a function and have it be correctly differentiated. That's a theoretical result, okay? So crap, what do you do? Well, an obvious thing to do is you design a language. There's a really horrible thing to do that I've watched throughout my whole career that I still see people redoing. TensorFlow is an example of this, which is you do the worst possible choice, which is you design a language, an ad hoc language with no surface syntax, and you program its construction from another language. That's what TensorFlow is. And I don't mean that TensorFlow is just a current example. So TensorFlow is this huge API. It's all about graph building. What are graphs? Poor man's language, right? And then they have to give semantics to everything, much of which was really ad hoc, and there really is no good semantics. Whereas, and then if you look at it, what are they trying to accomplish? One thing out of that 1,000, I don't really know what it is, out of a very large, huge API. One thing that's new, which is differentiation. Okay, so what I build, its footprint, the thing that you as a user experience should be one thing, and it should be called derivative. Now that takes some cleverness. Compiling the categories is a way to do that. That motivated my compiling to categories. That's part of what motivated my compiling categories work. Another is you want to do hardware generation or even just code generation, right? Like I want to generate code that runs on this funky mesh processor, right? And I want to use my existing language. It's a good language, right? It's just an implementation question. It's not a language question. Language is about expressiveness. APIs are about expressiveness. This is an implementation. So the funkiness shouldn't be visible in my API, right? That's an abstraction leak. That's an implementation showing up, all right? Okay, so I got to figure out how to take this language with its semantics intact and get this implementation. And that's tricky, but that's what compiling to categories accomplishes. That's what it's for, yeah. And that discipline in compiling categories and in homomorphic denotational design, a really important thing about that discipline is that it takes away almost all of your choices. It takes away almost all of your freedom. And what it leaves you with is the important part. So it takes away all these things that if you're designing a language, you would have to make a decision about that is easy to get wrong and really not the essence of what you're trying to do. It takes all of those away and it leaves you with the very essence of what you want to say. And an implementation puzzle, but it's a well-defined implementation puzzle that has an elegant, meaning simple in terms of mathematics we've already learned for some other reason, a precise way of expressing the theorem. Therefore, it's friendly and valuable to the user. And there is once you get into doing these homomorphic proofs, they're not all that hard. Some are tricky, okay. But even when they're hard, you're doing the essential hard work, not the inessential hard work, not like all this boilerplate stuff that, oh my God, the last 3 papers did, or, I just learned in class. Yeah. So.
Well, we already are talking about all of this for 2.5 hours, and we would like to keep it on 3 hours today. How about we give a strong shift towards the questions now? I think
I would love to do that, and I meant to do it at first, but I want to do that. But I think I just like to make a list just to put it out there so people get an idea of the breadth of what denotational design. I'm not going to go into any more examples, so I think this will take like 3 minutes. Does that work for you?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, for sure.
All right. So linear algebra we talked about. Another example is polynomials. So sometimes people want to manipulate polynomials, right? Or power series, infinite polynomials. Okay, so that as a thing, there's a representation, but there's a denotation. We know exactly what they mean. They mean functions. Polynomials and power series both mean functions. They're not linear, so we can't use we can't use matrices to represent them. They're something else. But we can do it, and then operations you do on polynomials: addition, multiplication, composition, inversion, differentiation, integration, all that kind of stuff. Every one of those has the same style, the homomorphic style of specification, which is like the meaning of the product of the polynomials is the product of the meaning of the polynomials. That's always what it is. Power series the same. Automatic differentiation, it's usually talked about in terms of graphs or sometimes a lambda calculus. And neither of those is what it means. It means functions. So automatic differentiation is you can specify it extremely simply by just saying we're talking about functions and functions that are differentiable. That's what it means, and that's very well defined. And we know things that are true, like the chain rule, and they are about functions. They're not about graphs, and they're not about the lambda calculus. Okay, and so the way I did automatic differentiation was exactly with denotational design. I set up the simplest possible specification in terms of homomorphisms. What's the meaning of automatic differentiation? The meaning is differentiation, for goodness sake. If you have some representation of a function, then it doesn't say it's code. What does it mean to differentiate? It means that if you take the meaning of the function and you take the calculus derivative of it, you get the same result as if you take the implementation notion of differentiation and then you take the meaning of that. So it's exactly the same style. Language recognition and parsing. A language has a very simple denotational model. It has nothing to do with regular expressions or push-down automata. It has nothing to do with parsers. Languages are sets of strings. That story will give you a notion. You can talk about recognition. You can talk about what it means to be correctly recognized in language. But also languages have explanations for when strings are in them, which you can formalize easily as proofs in a nice setting like the pentatypes. And then the implementation is a parser. So the idea of proof-relevant recognition is an explanation of parsing. Okay. What about SMT solvers? Satisfiability? Well, the meaning of what does SMT do? It takes a representation of a formula. What does the formula mean? It means a function from something to Boolean. It means a predicate. Okay. So the job of SMT is to correctly satisfy that predicate. So whereas usually it's talked about in terms of doing some kind of weird graph traversal. State machines. If you're doing hardware design or something else, you talk about state machines. State machines mean something. They're not the thing that matters. They're a meaning. And they mean often function from streams to streams. Those functions are often of a limited kind. That's not linear. It's what's called causal quite often. But that's a semantic thing. And then compilation is a nice example too. So what does it mean to correctly compile a language? All right. So you can talk about operational, this whole complicated story, but there's a much simpler, which is what does the language mean? Okay. So I have a source. So compilation is a mapping from a source language to an object language. The object language is the machine, right? Okay. So you get both of those denotations. So there's a function from source to a denotation. There's a from meanings. There's a function from the low-level thing to meanings, the same world of meanings. They have to be the same world or you can't talk about correctness. So then what it means to correctly compile a language is to say that the compiler, which maps my program from source to object, right? So if you compile mapping from source to object, That has to be, that's one path. Another path is you take up. So if you translate from the source to the object, and then you take the meaning of the object, so that's two legs of a triangle, versus you take one direct path, which is you go from the source language to its meaning, right? This is why they have to have the same meaning. Then that triangle commutes. In other words, if you go directly from the language to its meaning, or if you go indirectly through this implementation, you get exactly the same results. That's what it means to be a correct compiler.
Is that related to full abstraction? There was a question.
Full abstraction. Yeah. Okay. So let's go to the questions now. We can start with full abstraction.
Right. So there was John Sterling. He made a tweet saying that he was very impressed and he really liked the convincing I don't even know how to say this word, apologia for denotational semantics. And Simon Thompson replied, "What are the thoughts on full abstraction in this setting?" Because he points that all the nice concrete models don't give this for sequential computation, parallel, etc. And from my perspective, all the nice concrete models don't give this for sequential computation, parallel, etc. And from my perspective, that's when the notational semantics begins to lose its shine. Maybe he's also he was a little confused as well between we're not really talking about the notational semantics here, right?
Well, I don't think that's a central point here. I really appreciate his comment. My response to it is very much like, you asking about strong normalization and type preservation, all this kind of stuff, which is, it's the wrong question. It's a question that I've known Simon for a long time, and Simon Thompson, I respect him. But it's a question that comes out of this cultural conditioning of operational semantics, right? So there's something that is, I think his question embodies, that it's kind of assumed or believed to be a failure of denotational semantics. Okay, which is there's certain languages implementation, they have a denotational semantics, they have operational semantics, and full abstraction fails. Okay, full abstraction means that denotational equivalence and observable operational equivalence, which means like operational equivalence in every syntactic context, that those two coincide. That's an if and only if. If you look at denotationally, you look at it operationally, you get exactly the same notion of equivalence. So that's called full abstraction. Okay, and that's often considered to be a desirable thing, and a big deal if you fail. Okay, and also most of our languages that we have now fail at a lot of them fail at it. Okay, so like you can give a simple denotational semantics to say Haskell. When I say Haskell, I don't mean IO, I mean like genuinely functional. You can give a denotational semantics to it, quite simply, and then you can give some operational semantics, fine, and then you can ask this question about full abstraction. I think you find that it fails. Okay, but there are two really important things about this. One is that this failure is an accident, is a historical accident. Simon used the word sequential, right, in his tweet. Okay, so that's really an important word. It's subtle. Why do you bring up sequentiality? What does sequential have to do with anything? Okay, it's a technical term that does not mean the way we normally use the word sequential. It doesn't mean like the sequentiality of von Neumann programming, like a stateful C programming. It doesn't mean that kind of sequentiality. It really has to do with what kinds of implementation models seemed achievable in the 20th century, which has been over for a while now, by the way. 2022, right? Okay, so if you're a hardware person, this is a silly question, because hardware has no difficulty with this kind of full abstraction business. Okay, if you're a software person and your language was designed in the 20th century, or your language was designed by people who were trained in the 20th century, you're going to run into this problem. Okay, so an example is like in Haskell, for instance, and this is a classic. You can define and takes two Booleans and gives you a Boolean. And you want it to be computable, right? This is like, I want to compute and. Okay? Okay, now Haskell has bottoms, which operationally is thought of as non-termination, which denotationally means lack of information. Operationally means non-termination. Okay, lack of information. That's why it's called bottom. It's the bottom of the information ordering. There's nothing, Okay, so if you look carefully at the definition of and, or if you've been bitten by this issue before, you'll learn to find it quickly, which is that and is defined asymmetrically in a very subtle way, and that subtlety is in the sequential in the sense Simon used the word semantics of Haskell. Okay, so and looks like this. And of it's like and of false and of false and y. So if you have and your first argument is false and the second argument is y, for any y at all, the answer is false. Okay, and of true and y is y. Okay, so that's a definition. Okay, so that definition is subtly asymmetric in Haskell. It's not in Agda, but it is in Haskell. And what I mean is, if the second argument is bottom, if you want to think operationally, you think the second one doesn't terminate. Okay, all right. Then and of true and of false and bottom in Haskell is false. And if you switch the arguments, and of bottom and false by that definition is bottom. So and is not symmetric, and is not commutative, right? So what's going on? And or same issue. It looks a little different, same issue. So anyway, this question was identified quite a long time ago, and there's there's a famous result. I think it's Gordon Plotkin's result, which has to do with this something called PCF, partial computable functions. It was this kind of call by value, I think lambda calculus sort of a thing that we were using to explore early proof theory. This came out of Edinburgh LCF, and the brilliant work that was done to make that into a language and so on. What is it? What's missing that would make Haskell fully abstract is something called parallel or. Okay, that's the classical story. It's not really the thing. There are a bunch of different things you can add to fill this gap. Now, why? So, what is parallel or? It's the or, and you can tell the story for and instead. But let me tell it for and. It's the and that says this: if either argument is false, you should be false. Yeah. So, okay. Now, how do we implement it? Oh my God! Right? If I just said if either is false and the other could be bottom, which one do I evaluate first? That's the problem. The problem is the implementer is thinking, which do I evaluate first? And there's no winning answer. Because if you guess wrong, you're not going to terminate. If you guess right, you will. And you cannot find the answer to that question without taking the chance of guessing wrong. Okay? So if you believe that parallel computation is too expensive a thing to contemplate, then you will design your languages to prevent people from asking for it.
Right.
And that's what happened even to Haskell. Which was invented in the previous century, by the way, right?
Right.
Okay. Now, to a hardware person, you look at this is just a non-issue.
Yeah.
This issue is all about language designers being afraid of parallelism. Yeah. So it's very easy to fix. So that's one response. This is not a fundamental problem. It's very easily fixed. Okay. Now, I have a second response, which is a completely different issue, which is it's not important, even if it were true, it's not important. Because the very pretext of the question assumes that operational semantics is the kind of defining thing that denotational semantics has to live up to, right? This is right. So how did this happen? This is like men in our current culture get to define the discourse, right? And women have to kind of follow around. Rich people get to define the discourse, and poor people, right. And so on, right? So whatever the popular paradigm is, they're going to try and define the discourse. You got to be aware of that kind of thing, right? And ask, is this really a legitimate way of framing the discourse? Why should operational semantics get to say, it's like two people disagree. Like, say you and I are having a disagreement. I go around telling the story. You know what's wrong with Pedro? He disagrees with me. Right?
Yeah.
All right. And maybe I'm even have some, like I'm older than you and I publish a few more papers than you, something like that. So people are like, oh, I guess Conal must be the shit and Pedro's wrong, right? But no, you could be right and I could be wrong, right? Yeah, exactly. So we got to be clear about what is really the goal. And the goal is not for denotational to match operational any more than it's for operational to match denotational. My personal bias says, I wish to operational, I wish you'd be more denotational like, or something like that. But that's just my bias. It's not the truth, right? The truth is we're trying to accomplish something and it has nothing to do with full abstraction. Yeah. So those are two entirely different sort of responses. One is that it's not fundamentally true and it's completely archaic, the notion of being committed to sequentiality in the implementation. The very opposite is true. Sequentiality is what's expensive. Parallelism is what's dirt cheap. Sequentiality is an incredibly expensive thing. Almost all of the power, almost all of the electricity consumption, almost all of the computational muscle that we're executing today is wasted because of sequentiality. So sequentiality is not the thing we should be chasing after. It's a thing that we should be, thanking progress that we can just choose to be free of. And if you look at hardware, you see it's like everything is parallel. Like you don't even bother trying to line things up. What a waste that would be. So anyway, that's my response to that, the full abstraction question. Yeah. What else we got?
Here's one question from Jacob. Thank you very much for sending this question. And he's thinking, great interview. There was so much to unpack. Here are some comments. A consistent theme in this episode is the distinction between declarative knowledge and imperative knowledge. And he's always asking, what is knowledge exactly? But that's a little beyond the point. And he also points to a book that brings that all the time, which is The Structure and Interpretation of Computer Programs. And he gives the sections. And he points that you emphasize declarative knowledge almost to the exclusion of imperative knowledge. And he sympathizes with this viewpoint, as historically, it has mostly been the other way around in computer science, imperative knowledge coming before declarative knowledge. However, it seems to him that we can't take imperative knowledge out of the picture completely. For without it, we can't make computer do anything, and then the whole endeavor reduces to a thought experiment. In classical pure mathematics, one is not concerned with implementation, and so one can do all things of non-constructive, such as proving the existence of an object by showing that the assumption of its non-existence leads to a contradiction. To me, it seems that if we take imperative knowledge out of the picture completely, then we end up in the same situation as in classic pure mathematics. What do you think about this point? More concretely, while we formulate nice declarative programs in a high-level language such as Agda, that language must meet the machine at some point for the exercise to have any great interest. Otherwise, we might as well just go to pure mathematics. I think a little bit of this question goes back to the point that it was a lot more clearer in this episode, in the sense of how we're tying this gap, right, of the implementation and the denotation of what we're doing.
Yeah, I think so. I think I've already addressed it by clarifying that to me, certainly, and what I'm recommending is, you care very much about the implementation. You care so much about it that you address a realistic 21st century implementation. And how do you do that? That's what proof and specification are about. Yeah. So some people do get that impression from me. So it must be something I'm doing, that I don't care about implementation, but exactly the opposite is true. And if you care about implementation, if you don't care about its correctness, then it's easy. You just erase it all and call it right. If you do care about correctness, then you need a specification. If you care about that your claim that is correct is the truth, then you need proof. If you want that proof to be achievable, then you have to have some elegance in there. If you want the theorem, that is what the proof is claiming, to be useful, then it has to be elegant. It has to be simple. Yeah, and so that's why the denotation needs to be incredibly simple and take all of this machine accommodation out of it, and then you put it in spades and do a really good job, not some half-assed thing that tries to be both specification and implementation, but a really good one, and then you do the proof. Yeah. And I think the more efficient you want, the more that proof becomes necessary.
Right. Because then you can hand wave all those details. He also gives a really interesting quote from the great algebraist Erwin Kaplansky. So he says that we, Paul Halmos and I, share a philosophy about linear algebra. We think base is free, we write base is free. But when the chips are down, we close the office door and compute with matrices like Furry. I think this comes down really to the same point that you were mentioning, right? That at the end of the day, you're doing this implementation, but your reasoning is in this higher level. In their case, this base is free, which I thought really...
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it's a different strategy they're talking about, but I think they're talking about the same thing, which is that we want to have we might call it denotational versus operational, or they might call it a higher level, more abstract versus more concrete, or something like that. And they use them for different purposes. One is more computation friendly, and one is more reasoning friendly, and that's exactly what I'm talking about.
Right.
Yeah. And those guys are mathematicians, so they would appreciate the proof connection between the two, right? They know if you ask them, okay, you're computing with matrices, what does that do with linear transformations? Boom, it's at the top of their head. They know that.
Right. Yeah.
Otherwise they wouldn't do matrices. Yeah.
Right. Jacob also asked a very interesting question about what do you do in the case of errors and exceptions. I think you touched this a little bit
Yes.
with Haskell, but could you elaborate a little more?
Yeah. Yeah. I think this is I think this is more substantive question. In other words, I'm not going to like wave away this question and say, this is a poor question or this is a product of your conditioning. I think it is somewhat. So I think that with so errors are a really important issue. Right? Errors are like a formative issue in how we think about design of languages and libraries. Right? So and there's a broad spectrum of what people want to do with their errors. So there are people who love dynamic typing and they want their errors to just like come to life spontaneously at runtime. Right?
Right.
Hopefully in front of them and not their customer, but whatever. We'll take our chances here. Okay. So that's one way to deal with errors is you don't try to prevent them in your language or your library. Okay. And graphics programming, good heavens, is full of this kind of stuff. Like almost every graphics program, like OpenGL, either crashes or draws, or you get a black screen. That's like almost everything you could possibly do is that. Yeah. So and graphic programming has tons of state in it. I mean, these low-level graphics programming, tons of state, and the state has to be set up in just the right way. And there's no way a type system is gonna catch you when you do it wrong. So, okay. So what do we do? Well, what we have done is we've moved toward higher level languages and more expressive type systems. Okay. And higher level languages and more expressive type systems, they reduce. It's not that they don't prevent you from making mistakes; they catch those mistakes earlier. That's what a parser, right? A parser, like it's going to reject a lot of your programs. Now there are languages that really push the boundaries. Like you can pretty much type anything you want. We'll come up with an interpretation, and some people think that's a good thing. I prefer my compiler or type checker, my parser to reject, as much as it can. Yeah. So as far as errors, I think our first line of defense is prevention. Okay. And we do that by having higher level language and richer type systems. The richer type systems, maybe that's a little obvious how it prevents it, because like most things you write, oh, that's a type error, just like the parser. Oops, that's a parse error. Yeah. As far as high level, the reason for that is that high level, and then I'll say what I mean by high level. High level language is one with a simple denotational model. Okay, so it's expressive. You can talk about doing rich things or expressing rich things, computing rich things, but the mathematical world, the semantic domain in which you phrase those explanations, are simple. Okay, now machine-ish things, low-level things, including the imperative programming model itself, and also the model of processors that we use now, which is not true; it's a fiction. And then below that, the like microcoding and so on that's actually going on. And then below that, the analog, physics that's going on. Those are all much more complicated. Okay, so the job is those guys have to work in a more complicated world, and so their reasoning is going to be more complicated. What we want is the subset of things that are the subset of capabilities of the machine, small subset of behaviors of a machine that are the denotations of high-level programs, of simple things. The machine can do all kinds of stuff. But we are really interested in the very small set of behaviors that reflect correct execution of a simple notion programming. When I say simple, I don't mean weak. I mean very powerful, but based on elegance. In other words, like powerful expressiveness. Yeah. I don't remember if I'm answering the question. I think I lost track.
No, you did. I think the question was answered, and in a sense as well, he's asking like how to handle these errors and exceptions. And in my point of view, maybe I'm mistaken. Maybe I'm mistaken, but an error is just something that you could not capture in your semantic domain yet. So it means that you didn't capture that idea that makes it an exception, right? Because you don't have a good enough theory of what's going on, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I would say maybe more specifically, it's a failure of your type system. Now, maybe that's not a nice way to put it. Maybe I should say it's something that I hope a type system lets me prevent.
Yeah. So, for example, a canonical example of this issue is like in C, you always need to catch the exception when your pointer is null, right? But
Yeah.
what it means is actually that your pointer, your type system should know when it's new already,
Yes.
in that you don't have to dynamically check that ever.
Yeah, exactly.
Just what
Yeah.
Rust is trying to solve.
Yeah, yeah, and you can fix that with even something simple like Pascal, from a long time ago,
Right.
or C# or something like that, right? Just got to fix like you don't have null pointers. Get rid of that. That was Tony Hoare's $1 billion mistake.
Yep.
Right? But you can go further. You can do like divide by zero. That's another example. People go, what about divide by zero? That's a number that has the right type. Well, in Agda, divide by zero is a type error, and like how on earth could that work? Well, the division, and you can do this for in every situation. So I'm going to use the word partial. So a partial function, that's a function that for which the type says it can handle all this, but the truth is it can't. It can only handle a subset of it. So in other words, like it's a function, and you give the type of its input, but it only really works for some of its input. That's where errors come from. Okay, so you can take any partial function and make it into a total function with a standard simple recipe, and division is an example of this. So if you have A divided by B, there's actually a third argument, which is the proof that B is not zero.
Mm-hmm. So you're actually restricting the domain here.
Exactly. I take an A and a B and a proof that B isn't zero. Now, in order to populate all three of those arguments, B cannot possibly be zero. So it would be a type error. Now, there is an onus on the programmer. You have to come up with, somebody has to come up with a proof of non-zero. Okay, and that could be hard. In Agda, there's actually some idioms that in a lot of cases make that completely easy. In most cases, and where it's not easy, fine, you just fill in the proof yourself. It's not a problem. And you get, there's just like a little aesthetic thing of like, if it's ternary, not binary, I can't use infix. That's a drag. Right? I like to use infix. I like to use infix. It's prettier. All right. Well, so when you have to fill in that third argument, actually even that you can use infix. You can say A over B in parens, and then apply it to the third argument. And Agda, that third argument is what's called an implicit argument, which is a lot like type class instances in Haskell, and they can often be inferred automatically. And that one can under some circumstances. So there are tricks like that, and that's a general recipe that eliminates all partiality, because a partial function is a function for which you got the domain wrong. How do you get the domain right? Well, sometimes you need a more expressive type system. That's what dependent types gives you. And it's not like, oh, you got lucky. No, dependent types, we know, are equivalent to reasoning. They're equivalent to the foundations of mathematics, and they're equivalent to the human function we call reason. In other words, logic. Yeah. So if it's wrong, then there's a proof that it's wrong. If it's right, there's a proof that it's right. Okay. And you can, and if that proof is in a self-consistent logical framework, you can encode it in dependent types. So it's not just like a lucky win on this one. This is a general solution.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, for sure.
It takes retraining. Because people are used to just like, I'll just divide and hope for the best.
Another question that we got was from Nicholas. Thank you for sending this question, Nicholas. It's not much of a question. He is playing the devil advocate here for ecosystem. Let me read this. The entry barrier for Haskell and Agda is really high. I'm passionate about this stuff, but it still took me multiple attempts to develop even decent Haskell skills. People who are not already convinced of the value of Haskell are often intimidated by them, quickly dismiss it. I believe if a language is easy to learn, then it has a greater chance of developing a rich ecosystem. And I think from the industry perspective, this is really the greatest asset in a programming language can have, which is a rich ecosystem is even more important than all those metrics that are usually used to rate a programming language, like performance, code readability, error proneness, and so on. Of course, this is all correlated, but easy to learn can be an initial spark that turns into a good feedback loop, which is it's easier to learn, more people know how it works, bigger community, more libraries, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And
yeah, totally.
I think he has a great point as well, and in a sense, also it comes back to the issue of familiarity versus elegance in a sense, because once you learn Haskell, you have to agree in a sense it's very elegant, right? Like it's very simple and concise, and you can talk about it's closer to what we have of functions in mathematics. Let's put it that way. So there is this familiarity. However, there is this non-familiarity, which is how we usually program, which is imperative, right? So we're trying to bridge this gap. So there is these two forces at contention again here, right?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Well, so I agree with him that if you pick a familiar paradigm and maybe you make a tiny tweak on it. So let's just say you take Python and you throw in like some new thing, right? Um, if you take C sharp, something like that, you throw in a little thing, or you think like Rust, you throw in like, its way of thinking about memory management. Objective C has another funny way of thinking about memory management. Okay, all right. So the fact that you're telling people, all I'm asking you to learn is this tweak from what you know. Okay, I think that is much easier to bring people in, and you'll bring a lot more people in. Okay, but will you get anywhere of value?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to share something. I love this quote. This it's about Galileo, and this is from Frank Wilczek, who's a Nobel laureate, who wrote this lovely little book called "The Lightness of Being: Mass, Ether, and the Unification of Forces." Okay. So he says this, and I want you to think about these programmers, right, who want to stay within their frameworks. So he says, in Galileo's time, professors of philosophy and theology, the subjects were inseparable, produced grand discourses on the reality, on the nature of reality. Okay, professors of philosophy and theology produced grand discourses on the nature of reality, the structure of the universe, and the way the world works, all based on sophisticated metaphysical arguments. Okay. Meanwhile, Galileo measured how fast balls roll down inclined planes. How mundane! But the learned discourses, while grand, were vague. Galileo's investigations were clear and precise. The old metaphysics never progressed, while Galileo's work bore abundant and at length spectacular fruit. Galileo too cared about the big questions, but he realized that getting genuine answers requires patience and humility before the facts. Okay? So, what does this have to do with what we were just talking about? Making small tweaks, which is if Galileo, right, had come up with another small tweak to the theology of his day, it would have been much more accessible. He would have had a bigger user base. He would have had people, submitting pull requests on his GitHub repos, and all this stuff. He would have built. He would have taken advantage of the popularity of muddled thinking and of archaic pre-scientific mindset. Yeah, and he chose something else, and he chose an unpopular path. Right? I mean, Galileo was really, really a groundbreaker. I mean, that was like the difference before science and after science. We had Kepler roughly contemporary, a little after. We had Newton, a few decades later. We had Bacon a little before, but Bacon was really clear, but he didn't do science. He thought more clear than anyone else about science, right? And then way back to the Greeks, who had some good ideas, but they had no idea they didn't have the scientific method. They didn't have experimentation. They didn't have falsifiability. Okay. So who made more of an impact, right? The Galileo who did what he did, or the Galileo who, added some small tweak to the existing paradigm? So I think if you're going for popularity, you're going to find it by choosing not to do to make significant progress in science. Almost by definition, you're going to do it by reinforcing the existing paradigm. We've been seeing fundamental weaknesses in the existing paradigm of what computation is and how to describe it and how to talk about it being correct. We've been seeing that for many decades. We're heavily financially invested in this whole paradigm, but we're already at a crisis. One of the important aspects of that crisis is the deceleration of Moore's law. So we had this free lunch, just like the guys at Intel are going to keep cranking out faster chips, and we're going to keep writing sequential programs. But that curve has slowed dramatically, right? I mean, you're old enough, I think, to think about like how, oh my God, computers are like this year's computer is so much faster than last year's computer. That doesn't happen anymore, right? Right. So now we have sequential computation, which is the popular paradigm, right? That's running on parallel machines that are wasting most of their energy trying to pretend to be 1950 von Neumann sequential computer, right? When we could be doing so much more. And every so often we get a glimpse. Video games, right, created a market that welcomed graphics processors in. That was like the first time in a long time that there was a commercial motivation for doing a very different computer architecture. And since then, the CPU has been the slow processor in our machines. Like if you care about speed, you should not run on a CPU. And it's getting more and more true. The paths are diverging of efficiency, right? Yeah. So to choose to contribute to the existing paradigm, yes, you'll get more short-term popularity and kudos and external reinforcement. You'll get probably more raises because if you're working for a company and they're not trying to break new ground, yeah. But you're contributing your life energy, which is non-renewable, right? That's a precious resource. It's the precious resource we have, to a dead end. It's something we've known as a dead end for decades. Yeah. And so maybe it's worth it to go on your own and find a few other resonant souls who say, I want to do something that matters.
I think that is a very, very good note to finish the episode on. That is highly, deeply insightful. But before that, there is an invitation that we would like to do to whoever is listening, and particularly Dan, if he's interested, which is to keep this conversation going, to let's keep discussing about operational semantics and denotational semantics, denotational design, and the value behind that. Conal, you have training in, how would you describe it? What's the method there? We were talking about holding this discussion where is a much more fruitful discussion of sorts, right?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so another nod to Dan. I really enjoyed the conversation. I was touched and delighted and appreciative so much of what Dan said and the question you asked, Pedro, and so on, back and forth. And one thing I really loved what Dan said is he doesn't like debates. He like appreciated the conversation by proxy, which I like that term too. Yeah, and so often people are like trying to one up each other, score points and stuff like that. Like I have no interest at all in competitive conversations. So these questions around operational denotation, they're very important to me. And those aren't even the heart of the important questions. Truth is the important question. How can we build our civilization on top of solid foundations instead of what we've been doing, which means we're building on top of computation. We want it to be efficient. We want it to be correct. And the method, what people know how to do now, apparently aren't getting us there, right? Okay, so I think a lot of people care about these things. I care about that more than I care about being right about this denotational stuff or homomorphic this or that or something like that. Yeah? And I think Dan does too. So I was inspired. I really felt a resonance with like, I don't want to do a debate because in a debate, the point is winning, right? That's the goal. It's winning. Which another way to say that is to go in is to leave the conversation without having learned anything. Right? Yeah. Right. So because when we're right that's when we don't learn something. Right? Being right is like you only learn something by not already knowing it and being open to learn. Yeah, exactly. You call it being wrong or being being consciously ignorant, which is a wonderful state. Yeah. So anyway, I was inspired to think, it would be lovely to have a conversation with Dan or maybe with somebody else, particularly with somebody who has different biases from mine. But the goal has to be really clear. The goal is we're dedicated to getting to the truth, not to winning. Now, how do you do that? Anybody could say I'm dedicated to get to the truth, but when they get in there, they're really trying to win. Okay, so I have received training. I worked. I was trained in a work called nonviolent communication. It's a terrible name. It's not very explanatory at all. It's wonderful work by Marshall Rosenberg, who was a student of Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers, incredibly famous, influential, important human being, and I learned from him about how to have you might call negotiation or mediation or something in a win-win sort of way. And one of the important techniques that supports this goal of really getting to the truth is that each person, success looks like this. Each of us is able to reflect the other's point of view to the other person's satisfaction. It's very simple, and if I may say, elegant.
So every time someone says something, you have to repeat it back to me, and I have to say, "Okay, I like what I hear. You got the essence of what I said."
Exactly. Yeah. And then that can be like really annoying depending on how you do it. If I repeat your words back to you, right? Then that's not actually very helpful. I could have just written it down and read it. A robot could do that. Right. Instead, I paraphrase your words, and more than that, I take them deeply into my own being. So what I'm talking about is an intimate, vulnerable process. Okay. I listen to what you're saying. I take it into my own being and I meet myself there in what you're saying. And that's what each of us does. Now, how do we know whether we've gotten there? Well, probably we haven't. And that's fine because it's an iterative process. So I listen to what you say. I take it inside and see what I can really connect with. I try to ignore your prejudices and mine. Try to ignore your opinions and mine. I try to connect with, oh, this is what matters to him. Oh, look, that matters to me too. And then I speak from there. And I don't say, that reminds me of me, blah, 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 blah. That's not going to work. I say, I kind of think this is what you're getting at. I think this is the gist of what you're getting at. And if I get it right, you will have like a heart-opening, warming reaction in your body. I mean, when this thing works, you feel it in your innermost self. Yeah. And then the person who's facilitating watches. And if they don't see that happening, they kind of help every so often. It's like, let's back up and was that part? And so I'll reflect back to you, but really from myself. It's not a robotic. Some people do it that way. It's terrible. I hate listening to it. Everybody hates listening to us done that way. Yeah. Yeah. And then you will say, yeah, that part is kind of right. And there's this other part. And maybe that other part is something I missed, or it's actually something you didn't say. And my getting to the heart, right, and connecting heart to heart with you helps you get to the heart of it also. And then you share that. So we go back and forth in this process. And it's actually quite beautiful and moving. And it changes the whole dynamic from two people on opposite sides of the table or an issue to two people on the same side wondering, oh, now that we both see what we're both in touch with, that we both share, that we both care about, I was focused here, you were focused there. Thanks for helping widen my focus on what I care about. And you thank me for helping widen your focus on what you care about. Now we say, this is a bigger puzzle than I was paying attention to before.
Which is probably the case.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's the invitation. Now it doesn't have to be as touchy-feely and personal vulnerable as I'm talking about. I like it when it is. And so my beloved and I, we do like couples coaching, and we coached relationship workshops and that kind of thing. And that's absolutely what it's a deeply intimate process. But I think it's it can be done with the level of honesty and whatever level of vulnerability people are willing to in a scientific conversation. And at the bottom of our opinions are what we care about, right? And our opinions are this kind of superficial level. So if you kind of get past that, we what we care about. We care about the same thing, and that's what I heard.
Our values and beliefs are in the core.
Yeah. Well, area. I would say our values, not our beliefs.
Not your beliefs. Okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah. Our beliefs, I would say, are strategies for how to fulfill our values.
I think I'm thinking of a particular Portuguese that I'm trying to translate that doesn't quite translate to beliefs, but I get your point.
Yeah, the English word belief is a slippery thing. It comes from the word leaf, which means to wish. Yeah. So people use, and Alan Watts talked about this in our culture, people will talk about belief and faith as if it's the same thing, but he says they're actually opposites.
Right. Yeah. The word I'm thinking is closer to faith. Yeah. But people in our modern culture use faith the opposite of what he means. They use it to mean belief. Yeah. So Alan Watts says, so belief is a clinging. Belief says I'm willing to open myself to the information from the universe as long as it agrees with my preconceptions. Faith says I'm unconditionally willing to open myself to the reality of the universe. Wow.
And I'm willing to have my foundations, my beliefs be changed.
Wow.
That's a whole different thing.
Powerful.
And then he goes on to say, therefore, faith is the essential virtue of science when practiced with honesty.
Wow.
Right? Which is the opposite of what people believe now. Yeah. Yeah. Now, it's not always practiced with honesty, but that's its essence, is faith. It's what he called faith, not what people nowadays call faith.
Wow. I think, this is an even better quote to finish our conversation then. Can you say that again?
Okay. All right. So this is what he says. There's a little more context. The discovery of this reality is hindered rather than helped by belief, whether one believes in God or one believes in atheism. But we must make a clear distinction here between belief and faith, because in general practice, belief has come to mean a state of mind which is almost the opposite of faith. Belief, as I use the word here, is the insistence that the truth is what one would leaf or wish it to be. It's the insistence that truth is what one would leaf or wish it to be. The believer will open his mind to the truth on the condition that it fits in with his preconceived ideas and wishes. Faith, on the other hand, is an unreserved opening of the mind to the truth, whatever it may turn out to be. Faith has no preconceptions. It is a plunge into the unknown. Belief clings, but faith lets go. In this sense of the word, faith is the essential virtue of science, and likewise of any religion that is not self-deception. So this is Alan Watts in his book called The Wisdom of Insecurity. Beautiful.
Well, so that's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for your audience. Make sure to follow our Twitter at the D4All. If you have any questions or comments, send it to our website, www.typetheoryforall.com, or you can also send it through our email, typetheoryforall@gmail.com. And if you like this episode, make sure to share it with your friends. We have another 20 episodes before this one. Make sure to check those as well. So that's it. I hope to see you guys next time.